So I guess we can start slowly, so please take your seats. Thanks a lot. So welcome, good afternoon. Welcome here at the Oasis conference, here at the Swiss Re Center of Global Dialogue. My name is Aeberhardt. I'm going to host that conference together with Dickie, Whitaker from Oasis here at the center. I welcome you here, all of you here that are physically here. Thanks for taking that way to come here to Ruschlikon, but also the large crowd that we have online. I think we have some 150, 200 online participants that are here on the Teams channel. Before I actually start, I would like to make a few remarks why we at Swiss Re actually host that conference already for the 6th time and why we believe in the importance of Oasis. I would like to highlight 3 main aspects that I already mentioned a year ago when we all met, or a lot of you already met here at the conference. A year ago, we announced several initiatives that were just started. One was Oasis at Scale. That was a project where we wanted to bring Oasis to the next level, to the enterprise level. That one was started a bit more than a year ago, and now finally concluded or got to a level where the Oasis software architecture got to a level where you can actually use it in an enterprise setup. That's also what we at Swiss Re now did. We actually implemented that software, the latest version of it, and run it on a daily basis for our underwriting. The second part of Oasis, I already mentioned last year, is the increased momentum of the offering from vendors. You see it today. We have here in the back multiple vendors that show their capabilities, show their offering, or show their models. And we have an increasing number of models that are ready in Oasis that you can license via the Oasis framework. And please take also that opportunity today during the breaks, walk by the stands and get to know the products that are out there. The last part I always mention at those conferences is the collaboration and the community aspect. Oasis is not only a modeling framework, it's not only a software piece, but it's an important part, a collaboration part, it's an important part to bring the community together. By bringing the community together, also new initiatives rise out of that one. An example of that one is the joint model development we did with some industry partners around GEM and Oasis. A project also kicked off last year, concluded also that summer, and that's something we are very proud of, that we were part of that journey. And also today you will learn more from GEM and the involved industry partners how that collaboration actually worked. Before I hand over to Dickie to run us a bit through the agenda and his introductory remarks, a few housekeeping rules for those that are just on the Teams channel. If you have questions, you can do that via Slido. Also here in the room, you can either pose your questions via Slido or then also directly by raising your hand. But you can already prepare yourself, log into Slido, because we will also have specific questions on Slido for the entire audience. So with that, I would like to hand over to Dickie to run us through the next part of the agenda.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to add my welcome to all of you in the room and online. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's great to see so many people participating. I want to try and get some interaction with you, all of the audience, virtually and physically. We've got 3 questions that we're going to pose, and we're going to use word cloud for those of you that have come across before. So please, both in the room and online, can you get your smartphones out, get onto Slido, because otherwise you won't be able to see the wealth of knowledge that's going to come from hopefully all of you that are going to sign in and answer these questions. And I think these are questions that I'm not doing it sort of particularly for my own edification. I'm doing it because I think these are really important questions that set up the conversation and the discussion and the debate we're going to have in the next few hours. So I'm just going to, you can use your phones if you haven't already spotted it to actually pick it up here. So just on this, it's better if you use one word, right? And we've gotten to the first question, right? So this is the first question, and I'm going to try and describe this a little bit. So what we're trying to get a sense of here is how much does senior management, the boards, the executive groups that run the companies that you work for, what is the word or the words that you feel you hear from them? It could be efficiency, it could be innovation, it could be whatever, it could be nothing, actually. So, more efficiency, you can just try and make that into one word, that always helps. What we're trying to see is what that comes up with and see how common the feedback you get from your senior management is. And then obviously later on, we're going to see how that feeds into what people are going to be saying. So, well, as you can see on the screen, no surprises there, I suppose, yet. Climate change, inflation, yeah, well, you'd be glad to know, you've already seen, both of those topics are covered. Risk, reliability, innovation, speed. Speed's interesting. I wonder what speed for what. Well, I think we've got some clear patterns there. We're going to move on to the next one. So what we're trying to get at here is there a difference? There should be, I think, a difference in what underwriters, for those of you that interact with underwriters, what are underwriters asking of you? And, how does that connect with or not with everything else that's going on? Well, for those of us in the modeling business, accuracy is a bit of an issue, isn't it, maybe? Transparency. Well, I have to say that I feared that we were going to get the word that was coming out here would be cheap or, lowest expected loss. So either you're all being nice to your underwriters or possibly you're lying. It's the former, I'm sure. Okay, let's, I think, transparency and accuracy, that is interesting. Right, let's go on to the last one. So this one is a bit more relevant to, well, very relevant to Oasis. So assuming that you have whatever models you have in your organization, what are the barriers, if you like, to adopting new models, to getting choice, to be able to get some of the people whose banners are at the back operating within your organization? What are those, what are the reasons why you are not able to adopt more models? Well, I think the three biggest ones here are what I would have expected. That's what I tend to hear from people in the marketplace, certainly. And of course, they're all related in terms of resources, cost, and time. Okay, I think that's given us an idea. I hope you found that sort of interesting. I certainly did. So let's move on to the presentation, because I think we've probably done enough on that. So let me just move back one. So what is the biggest risk that any industry faces in its activity as a company within industry? The answer from lots of very smart people is strategic risk. That's the only thing that almost always can kill an organization or potentially devastate an industry. That's what killed off Kodak. That's what killed off Blockbuster. And I would suggest, although it's by no means a certainty yet, it is what is doing unbelievable damage to the traditional motor and car manufacturing business. And I was talking to a senior individual at a very large global company, and I was saying, sort of, what is their reason for backing Oasis? And how does that fit into their corporate strategy? And the answer came back from this senior individual was that they were moving as fast as they could to make sure that their very large company remained relevant in a world that was changing so quickly. And so I think strategic risk is a huge issue. And in fact, we have more than one insurance and reinsurance members of Oasis that are there because of that strategic risk issue. If, however, you think that in your organization that's not what is the big driver, and we've seen, in fact, that at least from the message you're getting, it isn't, then I would suggest you can look at one other one, which is that the insurance industry, from the information that I can find available, has the second highest cost ratio of any services-based business in the world. In some parts of the world, it's as high as 41%. The 41% of every euro of premium goes in costs. And that's combined with profits that can be 2 or 3 percentage points if we're lucky in a good year. That just sets us up for massive strategic risk. And interestingly enough, and I've got 2 quotations on here, one from some ex-colleagues of mine at Oliver Wyman, and one with some friends who work for a company called Cora, both of whom offer consulting around strategic risks. And Cora in particular, I think, has worked with 3 insurance companies around the world to help alleviate that strategic risk. And at least in one of those cases, Oasis was part of that solution. But innovation is the obvious solution to some of these strategic risks. But it isn't innovation of, let's just see what we can get from blockchain, let's just see what happens from AI, or the next good, cool company that comes along. The best way to deal with strategic risk is actually to look at a basket of strategic innovation options. And I think that one of the functions that Oasis has is to actually provide an innovation environment to simulate what's going on. The quote here on the screen is from a chief risk officer in the States a couple of years ago, who basically said, we're not innovating. You know, the risk world that most of us are in has been stagnant more or less for 30 years. And, you know, version 24 or something doesn't mean there's a significant change in that software. And what Oasis was set up to do when I set up Oasis nearly 11 years ago was to begin to change that landscape. And the choice in the models you can see here that Beat has already mentioned is sort of part of that. So when we were setting up the agenda for today, we tried to incorporate some elements that we think are important to safeguard the companies that you work for, to provide choice in models, and to bring innovation easily and cost efficiently to your doorstep. And as Beat said, I think one of the sort of poster childs for where we play a role is you can get any model in the world pretty much, including RMS and AR if they wanted to, but at the moment they choose not to, on the Oasis platform and be able to run those models from one platform, from one set of exposure standards and one set of result standards, and that should mean a lot. So Ben, who's coming on next, is going to talk about the technology that has moved us so far in those 11 years. We're going to see, as Beat has also mentioned, some examples about collaboration, because these problems are so complex, we are not going to fix them unless we actually bring collaboration to bear on what we're doing. And incidentally, if any of you ever wonder why some of the largest, most technically adept companies in the world, like Swiss, like Allianz, like the big brokers, like AXA, et cetera, are passionate believers in Oasis and what it's doing, it's not because they don't have the resources. It's not because they don't have lots of very smart technical people. It's because there is a realization that these problems are so big, the only way to fix it is at an industry level via collaboration. We're then going to hear from 2 people talking about a way that I think is going to radically change the cost base for the insurance industry and how we engage with the corporate world. And that offers a massive opportunity to all of us, whether you are underwriters or brokers or in the risk space, to have a new level of engagement with the corporate world. And I think it's the most exciting thing I've seen in my 40 years in the business. I suppose computers were quite exciting, thinking about it, actually. I quite like computers when they came out. The second most exciting thing I've seen in my 40 years. And then we're moving on to these challenging questions. We provide a forum for having this debate about climate change and about inflation. And I wouldn't want to say that we've got anywhere to fixing it, but we have a way of actually making sure that we can deal with that. And we're also about to publish some best practice standards on climate change. I hope I can keep my mouth shut when the panel's on, but I think there's some very clear goals and objectives for everybody that uses a risk model or wants to license a risk model around climate change. And then second to last, we're going to hear about uncertainty. And in the 27 or 8 years that I've been in the cat modeling business, it's been always that unanswered question. How do we actually use information about uncertainty That's assuming if the modelers provide that information, of course. How do we use that information in making useful decisions? How do we avoid the just give me a number type of problem that is too pervasive in, frankly, everybody that uses CAT models? And we're going to hear from Tom talking about that a little later on. And then this is, as Beata said, this is all still about choice. More choice, more models, probably multiple models, greater insight from those models, and that's what Oasis was set up to do. And I hope today you enjoy these series of discussions and debates. I hope you can engage with the modelers, and if you're online and you're not able to do that physically here, you can do that with them remotely later on, or you can contact us and we'll help you do that. So with that, I'm going to allow Beat to introduce the next speaker, but thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you, Dickie. So for the next session, I would like to introduce you to Ben Hayes, CTO of Oasis Palm-Tree. And he will run us through the Oasis at Scale project, where we stand and where we're heading to. That's all. So, Ben, thanks.
I think I need to get a new headshot. I don't like that picture. I'm not sure how old that is. That's a second bounce to my confidence after meeting Sybil Steinman for the first time in person today, and she said, "I thought you'd be taller." Anyway, onwards. So yeah, I'll give a little bit more detail on the Enterprise Oasis project, or Oasis at Scale. Bert's already mentioned it, and Dickie's talked a little bit about what we've been doing. I was encouraged to see a lot of the words that came up on the screen are in my presentation, so I can refer back to those, which is great, about speed and resilience. All right, so we'll go through the kind of story of where we're up to with this project. A little bit about the background, how we started the project, how we've been running it, some of the developments we've done and delivered so far, and then talk a little bit about the distributed platform, which is what Beat mentioned, Swiss Re have just put into production last week. So Oasis has been going for almost 11 years now, and we've had quite a lot of technological iterations over that time. The first delivery of Oasis back in 2014 was actually SQL Server based, and then we've done a number of things on top of that. K-Tools came out in 2015. Flamingo, which was our first user interface, came out in 2016, and then we kind of started to go more in the direction of building kind of industry standard platforms with model development kits. We kind of worked our UI and got to a point where the product was good and it was usable and people were using it. But in 2020, a subset of the users got together and said, we really want to take this to the next level. So they kind of got together, sponsored it, said, we'll put some money in for a 2-year project to focus on performance, i.e. speed, reliability, and add in any functionality to get this Oasis product to something that we can really use in anger. So we started that project in November 20. The first part of it was funded by the IDF, who most of you will know, I'm sure. And then we continued it with additional member funding from May 2021, just over halfway through now, and it should run to April 2023 on the current plan. So importantly for Oasis, it's always driven by user requirements. So we're not obviously a traditional software provider. We don't come up with an idea, build a product and try and sell it. We're constantly kind of interacting with the user groups to see what they want, and we prioritize any developments according to that. So we very much kind of kept that ethos through this project. We formed a technical steering group representing predominantly the board, but also very kind of active users, people that were already running Oasis in their organizations. And the process we went through was we spoke to all those people, we gathered requirements, very, very long list of requirements to start out with. I think I say there, 136 kind of separate requirement items. And they were, I think it's fair to say, quite varied in terms of the detail involved there. Some were very, very specific. Some were just, it needs to go faster. So what we did next was take that long list of requirements and get it independently prioritized by the kind of biggest users of Oasis at the time. Excuse me. And we consolidate that down into a set of actual deliverables. And then we really separated that out because we didn't, it was a big task and we're a relatively small team. So we decided to split it out into things that we should do internally and stuff that we could outsource to kind of software development companies. So once we started the project, we agreed it would be a 2-year project plan. The kind of domain-specific core Oasis tasks are being developed completely in-house. We go through 6 monthly kind of release cycles where it's not a big bang approach. We don't develop everything and then release it at the end of the 2 years. We've been incrementally releasing these functionalities throughout the whole process. And we have kind of near constant interaction with the technical steering group to review progress, go over priorities, make sure we're delivering what is actually required. The kind of platform piece was outsourced for development, and we broke that up into 3 what we call lots. One was a general distributed architecture design. One was a kind of reference implementation of that in the cloud. And the third was a kind of enhanced focus on data and analytics. So we put this out to tender. It's a company in NASDAQ won the tender process for those first 2 lots, which they developed and completed in April this year. And as Bert said already, Swiss Re have gone live with that product already. Lot 3 is still to be completed, and we're going to put that out to tender shortly. So in terms of what we've actually delivered so far, halfway through the project in the core Oasis kind of internal development, we've been going through all of the components. So Oasis is modular. We have lots of different bits that all fit together, and they all do separate functions. We've really been looking at all of those individual components and seeing if we can re-engineer them, update them to use the kind of latest technologies. Where we can, we're trying to shift from what was delivered in K-Tools, which was a C++ product, to a Python product. That really kind of opens up the open source aspect of the Oasis project to the broader community. Most of the people that are involved in Oasis are more conversant with Python than they are with C++. So that kind of adds to the reliability. We can get a lot more input from the community. Doesn't seem quite right that it's faster, but we have actually made it quite a lot faster by using some of the libraries out there now that are designed for Python to deal with big data. Python is a very popular language in data science, and there are some really, really good libraries being produced to run large calculations very, very quickly. So we're seeing significant speed improvements, even though you'd kind of traditionally think C++ would be much, much faster. I've got some examples of that on the next slide, I think. And in terms of the added functionality, I've just put a few items up here. There's a lot more than this has been delivered, but these are some of the highlights. So we're now supporting Parquet format files for exposure data, results data, and model data. Parquet is it's a kind of file format that's very, very compressed, which means you can store data on a lot less space. It's also very, very fast to read and write, so it kind of adds to that speed driver that we have. We've also built in OED validation tooling, so this is around the reliability. When we spoke to the users of Oasis as it was, most of the problems that people had was they were coming from not quite getting the OED files right, so representation of exposure data was kind of slightly wrong or slightly kind of misrepresenting what they intended, which was leading to errors in the actual execution itself. So the validation tooling helps to alleviate all of those problems. Some quite detailed things here. So Latin hypercube sampling and loss simulations, this just allows us to run far fewer samples, again, increasing performance to get the same results. We've just recently implemented kind of correlation across exposures. So we have peril group correlation included now. Cache disaggregation is going in at the moment. So this is kind of twofold. It allows us to disaggregate aggregate data, as you'd expect, but it's also about handling unknown data. So if we have unknown categories for property types, we can, based on where it is, say, make a better kind of estimation of the type of property it is. And we've added in support for the open results data standards, which Dickie alluded to early on. And just an example of some of the performance improvements we're seeing. So what we did at the beginning of this process in May 2021 was take 4 real models. So we've got JVA's US flood model, Guy Carpenter's Canadian flood, CoreLogic's US earthquake, and Impact Forecasting's European windstorm. So real models, big models. We got a real portfolio, which was anonymized, set at the top here with 258,000 locations. And we tried running this through the software as well at the time. And then every release, we kind of we update those numbers and see how much faster we're getting with each release. And you can see that the numbers in red are the kind of difference between what it was at the beginning and what it is now. So we're getting better. You know, it's not step changes quite yet, but we'll talk about that in a second. What I would just say on this was we got members of the technical steering group here to run the same portfolio through RMS and AIR, and they were slower than the original numbers. So we were already faster than RMS and AIR, but we're getting much, much faster now. So we're down to kind of in the region of half an hour to do full ground up gross and reinsurance losses with decent sized portfolios on real big models. Right, so moving on to the distributed platform. So I said, all of the other stuff was developed in-house. This was the bit that we kind of outsourced. And why did we decide to take this approach? It was really to integrate with the latest industry deployment standards. We use a piece of technology called Kubernetes, which some of you might be aware of, but it allows you to kind of break up a job and run a single big task on lots and lots of small machines. And it helps you to kind of manage and orchestrate those jobs as well. So that kind of drives to increase in performance and increases in reliability because it's a kind of industry standard product. I just picked this statistic up. I thought it was quite interesting. From the Cloud Native Computing Foundation survey from last year. This is an open source foundation. They get a lot of members. They've got something like 10,000 members, but they surveyed 3,800 of them, and 69% last year said they're already using Kubernetes in production. And the real driver here is this is what we want. We want Oasis deployment to become very simple. This was something that came up on the word cloud as well, was kind of simplicity in installation. If we can get to the point where, cat modeling isn't run on a separate server in the corner that only one person understands, that makes it much, much easier to install if it's standard. And the approach, I kind of touched on this briefly early on, but we broke up the development here into 3 lots. So the first lot was a general Kubernetes design piece. This was about proving really that Oasis could work in this type of architecture. So we built a reference Kubernetes architecture. That's kind of shorthand for Kubernetes, K8S. And we demonstrated some of the functionality that you can get here. So things like auto scaling, this is where at the beginning of a job, it can figure out how big the job is and spin up enough computers to actually run that job in a kind of acceptable time. We also built into that this streamlined model deployment, again, trying to make it easier to deploy for people using it. Security and user management was another piece. Historically, we'd kind of left that to whoever was installing Oasis themselves, but we wanted to show how we could integrate with standard user management systems and job prioritization as well. So allowing you to, if you've got lots of jobs running, decide which ones go first. So that's a general Kubernetes design. And that's out there, and it's all open source, and anyone can pick it up and install it on, you can install it on a laptop, you can install it on a server, you can install it to cloud if you want to. The second lot was about taking that and doing a reference piece in Microsoft Azure. Now, historically, we'd always worked in AWS, but the technical steering group, 9 out of 10 of them said, we want to run it in Azure, so we decided to switch at that point. So lot 2 was about taking that general design and showing how you could build it in a real cloud platform, how you can take advantage of the kind of native tooling in the platform to make these things easier to manage, so linking with Azure services, and also building out on that kind of general security to show how it could be implemented. So they're both done, they're delivered. Lot 2 is delivered in April. So Swiss are already using it, it's going to production this week. Allianz are installing it at the moment, and a few more people. NASDAQ are also installing it. And then the final piece, which I touched on, said we're still kind of outstanding with, is lot 3, and this is around data and analytics. So it's really about kind of efficient retrieval and use of model data, which again reflects back to the word cloud. One of the big words that came up there was under ITIL want transparency. If we can get this model data kind of into the hands of the users in a more efficient way, because it's very, very big, then we can kind of start to make the whole thing a lot more transparent. On top of that, we've got improved exposure result storage and also logging and visibility into the system, which comes back to the reliability aspect that we're looking at. Lot 3 is still outstanding. We are about to tender for it. We're just trying to figure out the approach we take on that, but I anticipate that'll be delivered by April next year at the end of the project. That was it for me. Thank you.
Just before you ask any questions, or ask for any questions, I just want to say actually a couple of things. So one is that, one of the things we try and do is measure ourselves against other platforms. Why wouldn't we? That's a benchmark we need to look at. And I think one of the things Ben has said is, so one, he's made the point that independently we've verified we've got the fastest platform and it's only going to get faster. Second one is we have actually done a bit of work looking at features and how our features compare with other model platforms. I'm fairly sure, we haven't actually quite measured these, but I'm fairly sure we probably got, what do you think, Ben? I'll ask you the question before I say it, maybe.
Yeah, I think we're on parity now. So that requirements gathering exercise, a lot of that was about saying what don't we have that other platforms have, and those were prioritized. So we've delivered certainly more than 50% of those requirements, and the important ones came first. So they're largely there already. I estimate we're parity. It might be worth.
I'd estimate we're a bit more than parity.
A bit more than parity.
I'll take your parity for the moment. And then I think the other aspect is, we're the only one with an independent, verified financial module. I don't think there's anybody else out there that's got that. That's used across the board. So there's that as well.
Yeah, I mean that's a big. It's a big selling point for Oasis in general is the financial module is consistent across all models. So, model providers are fantastic and really understand what they're doing, but they don't necessarily understand how insurance terms and conditions should be applied. So by decoupling the financial module and making it generic across all third-party model providers, you just give that consistency and transparency.
And then maybe lastly, to come to the reliability bit, you've got companies like Guy Carpenter. I think Guy Carpenter run more analysis than anybody else. Where's Simos? Is he still? How many a week do you run, roughly?
Hundreds.
Right, so they do about 200 a week, and these are some decent-sized portfolios. So the point is that it's the fastest, probably the most featured platform, the only independent financial module, and it's tested for reliability. So if anybody has any doubts about it, come and see us later, and we can make sure we can get it installed for you. That was what I was going to say. Anyway, questions?
Yeah.
So any questions here in the room?
Quickly. Or do we have some?
We got one online one. What's planned for us after April 2023, Ben?
In terms, well,
development,
I guess in terms of development, I mean, there are requirements on that list that we decided didn't need to go in. I guess it just, you know, it's still a live product. It will continue to develop. We have, I didn't mention it, but on the slide, a couple of the models that we showed use what we call a complex model wrapper, and that allows model providers to write their own piece of software to do certain parts of the loss calculation itself. If the core Oasis functionality doesn't cover some aspect of correlation, say, or whatever. And what I'd like to do is get more of those things in. So if we can say 3 model providers are each doing roughly the same kind of thing, but in slightly different ways, can we make that generic? Can we bring it into Oasis, make it easier for them and available for other people? But I think it's, you know, it's, as I said, we have constant contact with the technical steering group who represent the user group as a whole. And we just drive developments based on whatever their feedback is.
Good. So thanks a lot, Ben. I just can also add on, we can confirm that it runs. We use it on a daily basis. So we use it on a productive level. In terms of performance and speed, can also confirm it works well. And we can use it. There might be one platform that is even a bit faster, but that's another story. That might be. Anyhow, so now let's move on then to the next session. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Thank you.
So one applause. So next session is all about collaborating and bringing things together. So I would like to welcome John Schneider, the Chief Secretary from GEM, Ole Hanekop from the Nat Cat Actuary at the Hannover, and Michale Ewald, Earthquake Peril Lead at Swiss Re. They will give us some insight how the collaboration actually went around the joint model development for the Earthquake China model. We will start with John, who gives us a big picture around GEM. And then Ole and Michi, who will give us a few insights how that collaboration actually worked. Oh, John, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Beat. Great pleasure of mine to be here. It's been 3 years since I've been to this meeting. I think I missed the last one. A lot has changed at GEM, and one of those is a growing development that we'd like to talk to you about today, which is how we're collaborating to develop risk models, financial loss models through Oasis, and also through Verisk's touchstone process. So the outline here will give a little bit of background on the evolution of GEM over that period where we sit today, give you some context, a description of a modeling task force that we developed with our colleagues, our sponsors, partners, and then you'll hear from Michale and from Ole about Swiss Re's and Hannover's experience in working through this process. So 3 years ago, I presented a slide, something like this, in which I said, look, you know, GEM has been working for the last decade, since 2009, developing, you know, very good science, very good engineering-based information and models, but we're more like the farmers producing potatoes. And we're actually, you know, now in a position where we perhaps should be delivering something a little closer to what you might call consumable products, represented here by the French fries. Excuse the analogy, but anyway, to explain exactly a little bit about you know, the leap for us to go from potatoes to French fries. But to elaborate a little bit further, I think today in that partnership component, partnerships for us is really a spectrum. It's a going all the way from collaborations within the UN system, in working with developing countries, working with governments, also working with the private sector and engineering companies, So we have a very well-developed and multifaceted public-private partnership and so forth. But it's a very rich environment within which to work and to think not only about risk in terms of that can be used by the insurance industry, but also in terms of mitigation and other products that can be used across the disaster risk reduction sector. So data, tools, and engine. All right, we have OpenQuake, which is a free software, and it's used quite widely around the world now for in academia as well as in engineering sector, and increasingly also by insurance sector and helping to understand better the science and engineering behind models. And we have a global exposure database, which is also being applied within a multi-hazard risk context and risk metrics that are being developed for other applications. In 2018, we released the global earthquake hazard and risk maps. These were based on a mosaic of hazard and risk models developed with collaborators around the world. Some of those models were developed and are being input to improve or revise building codes. They're again being used for risk mitigation applications in planning. And increasingly there's great interest in using hazard models in particular for catastrophe bonds and other ILS products. And then the more consumable in this context models, we now have 3 cat loss models for earthquake for South Africa, Colombia, and China, available, built through on the Oasis platform and available through NASDAQ and Verisk. We've also developed a broad strategic plan which takes us from today to 2030, where our focus will most certainly always be heavily on the earthquake work that we do, and moving more towards evaluating secondary hazards and improving the science and engineering behind those. But increasingly, partnerships within a multi-hazard context, looking at systemic risk issues that are broadly of interest to many stakeholders. And ultimately, within this, the ideal is to develop integrated risk solutions for resilience. So a bit of a buzzwords at this point, I think, but I think we're all striving to be part of the bigger picture. So this is, and the strategic plan is available to you if you'd like to see it. So now to our partnership within industry. We had initially Swiss Re, Hannover Re partner, the Institute for Catastrophe Risk Management in Singapore, FM Global, Guy Carpenter, all interested in working with us on building models. The idea was to have a transparent process for developing models for commercial applications, to leverage GEM expertise in hazard and risk assessment within industry, or with industry expertise and data, so get a nice leverage from both, and with a particular focus on loss models for financial risk management. So one of the tasks is to develop some consensus on what models we should be building, and a result of some discussions this morning suggested perhaps we really should be including many of you out here who perhaps are not involved with GEM, perhaps are not already sponsors, to see what your interest might be. So the Secretariat's role is really taking our ground-up loss models developed through OpenQuake and building those out into the Oasis or Touchstone formats, doing additional testing and validation, and creating what we would call a GEM view of risk, but informed by industry and academic expertise and data. Our partners then, in turn, are providing anonymized information on historical losses, on exposure, on vulnerability. They're testing the models against their own data and providing feedback. And then the solution is ultimately GEM's to decide. For the China model, which was really our, I guess, our real first concerted effort to do this as in a regular, well-defined process. I just first mentioned, so the hazard component is really developed in-house with public sources of information, and ultimately ends up being the source of generating the stochastic event sets that then get put into Oasis and are driven by then the Oasis risk model or risk platform, risk analysis platform. But there are many components of that model which we think are quite unique. It's fundamentally in the southwestern part of China. It's driven by a tectonic model, so it considers the movement of faults and so forth as measured by geodetic measurements as well as earthquake seismicity. So it's quite an advanced model, and if you're interested again in learning more about that, happy to talk. And then in terms of taking the hazard model and the associated vulnerability together into Oasis, then there's a conversion process of taking the intensity measures from these hazard footprints, putting them into a single measure within Oasis, something that we think can be improved. A variable grid to look at hazard, where you have risk concentrations. Converting models, we take an engineering-based approach in vulnerability, looking initially very much at structural types. So converting that into exposure that is more in line with industry standard is part of that process, and then the validation. And then part of our process here, just an example, was in China to take 10 events from the past century and one very old event, and to compare things like the intensity maps from those events from other measurements that had been made, such as by the USGS, and where there were loss data available, then obviously we relied in part on our industry partners to help us with anonymized data that could help us. Here's just an example of the average annual losses generated down to the lowest administrative level, coming out of the Oasis model. And just to give you a snapshot, the 3 models that we have available, they're fully documented and on those platforms. And I think one of the advantages of this approach too is that if if it's of interest to you to use these models, you don't have to accept our view of risk. You can modify it for your own if you have the tools and interest to do that. Current plan for additional models. This is also very open to discussion. We have our own sort of priority list, but if you have an interest in working with us on a particular model, please talk to us. The next steps in this process, we think overall this trusted environment of working together with our industry partners is working very well. That the process is being further improved, and we'd certainly appreciate others to join. And yes, we seek interest in priorities, so very interested to talk to you. I'd like to turn it over to Michale now, who talk about Swiss Re's experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, happy to give a bit more color how such a collaboration GEM industry actually looks like for the participants. And I go back, or start rather, really with the people. So as John said, I mean, the model we develop, or what we're aiming at in this collaboration, is a GEM model. So the development team is really the workforce is on the GEM side. So you have all the leads from the three, say, main parties in GEM involved, so on the hazard, on the risk, on the IT side, so Marco, Vito, and Paul. And then additionally staff coming in respective here to the China model, like Katharina on the vulnerability side. And the collaborators, as you see the list we saw it before, they really steer the project by giving feedback, by giving advice on where to look, say, more closely, and provide, say, benchmarks, review then the model development, and once they say this project is finished, prioritize future developments. And as John already said, the aim is to have then really the model built in Oasis, in a native in Oasis, so to say, because that's important, because it allows all the parties to install the model version that comes from GEM in-house, test it, run it with any exposure, and based on that, give the feedback. So that's really the enabler for that. And then the distribution routes commercially can be NASDAQ, can be Verisk. The models we've seen already. During that process, also we identify certain gaps. John mentioned already multiple intensities. That's something we worked on during that process. We also saw post-loss amplification as something lacking in the, say, Oasis framework. And so we identify these things to decide who's going to work on that. Say, for example, Swiss Re does a prototype. We share that with Oasis, with GEM, and so bring the model and the platform itself forward. Quick look at the timeline for this project. As you see, I mean, the details are not important. What's important here is it's a very short timeline. So it's really just 3 months, start to end, to build this reference GEM model as it's then released at a later stage. And this serves for the participants in the collaboration as the starting point to build and adopt their in-house model. So what we install at the end, or what we use now, what runs at Swiss Re, is not the China model that you can license from NASDAQ, but it's our version built on that. And again, Oasis is obviously, as it's open source, an enabler to do exactly that. So that would be more complicated in a closed environment. Just a quick look on day-to-day work. So again, that's the group. They work together with the standard tools that you use for any other collaboration. So we use Git to exchange the large data sets, to exchange the model versions. We have a MS Teams channel to chat, to exchange, to send back quick results, benchmark data, etc. And you just have as you see at the corner up there, it's a specific, say, MS Teams instance to keep it completely separate from the Swiss Re instance. So obviously, Beat cannot ping me while I'm in the GEM meeting, for example. And just finally, as already said, it runs really this model now productive since last week on Swiss Re premises, will be run during the renewal operatively, but it's fully integrated in our modeling platform. So the user does not see any difference to any other Swiss Re model. The whole, say, data exposure data conversion at the input is done behind the scenes. It runs wherever it runs. Nobody has to care about. The results are converted back from the Oasis full sampled output and produces the, say, result screen that any underwriter is used to. And yeah, that was a big work for a lot of people at and around Swiss Re, but we're happy that we achieved that. And with that, I think I give to Ole for a bit more details.
Yeah, thank you, Michi. Yeah, I would add basically what we as Hannover try to contribute to the whole project, and that really goes back to what GEM originally was about, a public-private partnership where public entities as well as we as companies, mainly from the insurance, reinsurance area, work together to achieve certain goals that are finally beneficial for both parties and both sides. In this particular project, our main focus as Hannover was to have the scientific exchange, so to get the deeper insight that came from GEM and that they contributed originally to the overall discussions. And in turn, we were able to hand over our experience that we did in generating our own view of risk, which we as Hannover, just as Swiss Re, basically do for each and every model. So even though we license most of the models that we are using, we are generating our own view of risk. And the way how we do it is something that we contributed to this process. Just to give you an example, the first working bit when you want to calibrate the model is obviously you need to see what is actually what you put into the model and resolution around that. So within Oasis, you've got the typical spacings of the hazard grids, but as well exposure-wise. So we, for example, checked whether the locations of exposure values that GEM used in order to calibrate the model somehow matched what we receive in our insurance data and could give feedback regarding that, or certain areas where we see more risk than, for example, GEM would have seen, what then would have distorted model market losses, for example. Another example that we did is basically for us the most simplistic thing, and that is really run the model against the portfolio of exposures that we've got and where ideally we've got historical loss information. And that is as well something that we shared with GEM to give them a better insight on how well that model fits the historical record that we've seen for certain programs. And one of the things, for example, that we figured out here was that in the frequency range, the model might generate too high losses, and that's something that GEM should have worked on. So these figures are not from the final version of the model. So in general, we basically try to contribute what we could contribute for the different components of the model. And in general, it's really the message that we wanted to send over to GEM that without the industry data, it's very difficult to come up with a model that is really usable for the industry. And I think that's really something that we can add in those discussions. In addition, we get this already mentioned interaction and better understanding of the different views to really come up with a good result. As Michi already mentioned, obviously the time frame of 3 months is very difficult given the different peak times for the participating companies as well as the GEM staff. So that is something that we need to revise, whether that is really good. On the other hand, it's good not to have endless projects, but to have a certain timeline that you want to stick to. And even though we could not share most of the data that we as a reinsurance company have got, because it's actually not our data, but the data of our cedents or our clients, we are able to provide anonymized information back to GEM to help them adjust the model. So our general experience in cooperation with GEM, and that goes back for more than 13 years now, is that GEM now is really able to bring out models that can be used within the industry. And they provided a lot of helpful scripts that were already mentioned earlier that does not only allow us to use them to build our own view of risk for China earthquake, but as well to use the very same scripts and mapping functionalities to generate other models based on hazard data that is provided by GEM. So one example would be that we've been working on a North Africa model based on GEM hazard, adding our own vulnerability functions. And that as well is something that gets enabled from these partnerships and common exercises that we've been doing. So finally, we can conclude that overall the GEM staff in this whole cooperation was very helpful and as well fast in response. And that does not only apply to this project, but as well our general experience that we made. And with that, I would like to conclude that part. Thank you.
For your presentation, we would like to open floor for questions here in the room. Anybody specific question on it?
Sort of question, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things we were talking about this morning was you've got this massively useful global resource in GEM, and you've got really some great skills from people that you already heard from on stage and some others you haven't heard from. So one of the things we agreed this morning was we're going to work with GEM to try and identify a new group of users that aren't already connected with GEM, who want to get models for parts of the world that they need some insight into, that have all the benefits you would expect of a combination of Gen Oasis. So it's open in both cases. It's based on core science. As Oli has already said, and Michale as well, it's based on knowledge about what really matters in the world. So please let John or I know afterwards, and we'll be happy to try and help get some more models onto the desktop of you. Any other questions? That wasn't a question. Any questions, I should say. Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. That's fantastic. Yep. Great. Okay. So next two speakers, very exciting, this one, Lee Worth and Rob Bartlett. Rob is CEO of Big Ticket, and Lee is head of, I'm going to get the title right, head of group insurance for Specsavers, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Dickie. Gosh, the second most exciting thing Dickie's ever come across. No pressure then. Hi, I'm Rob Bartlett. I'm one of the co-founders of Big Ticket, and I'm joined on the stage today by Lee Worth, head of insurance at Specsavers, a multi-billion-dollar ophthalmic business. And we're here really to talk about digital innovation and how it helps the corporate buyer, because we need to remember as an industry, every dollar of premium that the reinsurance industry, for example, receives starts with a primary transaction. So it's been a 3-year journey. I started Big Ticket 3 years ago with MasterCard and a number of industry actors and my 3 co-founders. And we started it basically looking at the opportunity around digital infrastructure because we felt there were certain pain points that weren't being satisfactorily solved. That has been a journey of 3 years, as I say, and in February this year, we took Big Ticket out into an independent entity, and now we're working with 30 of the leading brokers, insurers, and reinsurers, a number of corporates, because Lee is a founding member of our Global Client Council, because we want the voice of the end customer to be central to what we do, and a number of growing insurtechs as well, facilitated by Oasis. So why did we start Big Ticket? Our thesis was that digital infrastructure was necessary for digital innovation, and the insurance industry simply doesn't have it, and that's what we've built here. When we talk about digital infrastructure, we're talking about things, to use a parallel example, things like Plaid in the banking space, MasterCard and Swift, things that allow industry participants to collaborate to actually solve common pain points and to do things that they couldn't do on their own, echoing some of the points that Dickie was making earlier on today. So what does that mean in practice? It means in practice digitally connecting every corporate in the world, to every insurance broker, to every insurer, and to every reinsurer, and to a growing ecosystem of insurtechs. And why is that relevant to Oasis here? Well, I'll give you an example. So one of our insurtech partners does things like extract exposure and valuation data from corporates using artificial intelligence. Now today, they are buried in the middle and back office of insurers doing quality control work, rather like Detroit used to do quality control work in 1973. You build the car, then work out if it's any good. What we do is allow them to digitally connect with insurance brokers and corporates to take those insights into the front office of brokers and into the hands of insurance buyers, essentially allowing insurance buyers to do the quality control work on behalf of the industry. Now, of course, that's relevant to Oasis because, again, Oasis partners develop models and insights around climate. Again, today, they are largely restricted to the middle and back office of insurers and reinsurers. We give those the opportunity to take those insights into the front office and into the hands of corporates themselves. And we think that's extraordinarily exciting. However, I think it's probably most important everybody in this room and online hears from actually the person that matters most, the person that actually buys insurance, that actually pays all of us. So let me pass it across to Lee for his comments.
Thanks, Rob. When I started working with Rob on Big Ticket, the purpose was to try and connect insurance buyers and insurers virtually, digitally, but actually it's a great opportunity and unexpected bonus to actually connect face to face. So it's been a real good opportunity, and thank you very much for inviting us today. So as Rob said, my name's Lee Worth. I'm head of insurance at Specsavers. Predominantly my background has been on the broken side. So I've worked for Marsh, Gallagher's and Willis. In that time, managing or servicing the global clients, the major corporates. But also within there, did some secondments to the insurable risk teams. Most notably, I spent 12 months at BP. And then in 2019, made the decision to move across from the broken to the in-house team at a company called Amy PLC, who are UK infrastructure. They ran the insurance team there. And then 3 months ago, moved across to Specsavers. So Specsavers, for those from the UK, will be a very familiar name. We are on the high street in the UK, predominantly selling glasses, but also there as a healthcare provider, doing eye tests, hearing tests. And we really see ourselves as part of that community. But we're not just in the UK, we're also very big in Australia, New Zealand. We are big in the Nordics, the Netherlands. We've just gone into Canada and also very recently into Belgium. But we're not just a retail function or a healthcare function. Actually, it's quite a complex business. It's still privately owned, so it's still owned by Doug and Mary, who started in the 80s. As Rob said, it's now a multi-billion-pound business. But also it's there providing the cover from the supply chain. So we own parts of the supply chain through to the manufacturing, distribution, and then the model for the retail is a JV model. But it means that the risk that we are looking after within the insurance industry spans all of that. And even our manufacturing and our distribution, we've got things in a big site in China. We've got a big site in Hungary as well. But really are touching that global footprint. One of the reasons we are talking to Big Ticket is around trying to create value in the industry, and certainly value for us. Whenever we look at the insurance team within corporates, we've got to avoid being seen there as a cost. And especially if I look at, or bring risk functions into this, we don't want any red tape, we don't want any extra burden. What we're looking to do is see how we can create value for the industry. So I'm going to take a little bit of risk. I'm going to move away from my notes that I had planned actually, because I want to reflect on some of those words which came up on the word cloud earlier, because I think they're really relevant to what we're doing. So there was speed, accuracy, and transparency. So if I look at speed, right, we are talking about trying to create something that's a more digitized industry. We're getting there. It's getting there slowly. But one of the exciting things that I'm working with Big Ticket on is understanding how we can get that transfer of data from our business through to you guys seamlessly. At the moment, it is a long process. So we start probably 6 months out from renewal. For those major global businesses, if we don't have a RIMS platform to use, we'll send out a spreadsheet to each of the heads of territories. There could be 5, 10, 15, 30 territories that have to then go and complete a property spreadsheet. So you might get some of that back straight away. A lot of it would take a couple of months. So really from start to finish, to get that data, which you guys need, insurers need, but also we need, is a process which takes many months. And then if we look at accuracy, if it's taken us that many months to get that data, and invariably not all of it will be completed, some of it will have to take a view on whether we index link it, etc. But if we start that process 4 or 5 months out, by the time we actually get through to renewal, we're then at data which is 4 or 5 months out of date. And we're relying on that for another 12 months renewal. The idea with Big Ticket, and the bit which we would like to get to at some point around the horizons, which Rob will talk about later, is being able to get seamless data from our systems at a push of a button. So we don't have to worry about this 4-month, 5-month lead-in time. Actually, what we'll be able to do is just simply extract the data from our system, transfer it seamlessly through to the insurers, not avoiding what we really need to do around the context of the data, but making that process seamless. And why that's important for us is we want to move away from the administration of collecting this data and do the part which is critical to us, which is really analysing and getting under the skin of it. Where we create value for our business is being able to give context to the data, but also where we want to get to is get the visibility from insurers around what those models do, what they look like, what the inputs are, what the influences are. So we can really get that visibility around how we can support you guys in being able to tailor the data that we're given, whether that needs to be enhanced, whether it needs to be changed, or certainly working with brokers to be able to give the context to the information. So the purpose of us connecting isn't just that we want to keep giving the same data and it takes us a long time to do so. What we want to be able to do is understand from you guys what information you need and see if we can streamline that process. So that's where I think that transparency bit comes in. It comes in for us. We want to see what drives those models. And if we can see what drives those models, we can then feed back into the business, whether we need to be collecting new data or extra data, or where those risk mitigations might come from. So I think that's the three areas of that I wanted to cover. But the other bit, which is, for me, probably the most exciting bit, is really around driving some innovation. So it's not really for me to stand here and tell you what I think we should be doing. You know, I leave that to the creative minds. But if we get into a position where we've got plenty of data that we can provide to you guys, and we can do it in real time, then we might be able to move away from things like this long cycle, this 6 months renewal cycle that we need to enter into, and actually develop something more, more appropriate for businesses these days. And touching on something which Dickie mentioned earlier about strategic risks. If I look at the risk register for our business, there's very few risks on there which we can consider being insurable. Now, that might be an argument to say we're insuring it, so therefore it doesn't reach that, that risk register. But there's plenty of stuff that we know there isn't the traditional market to go out and buy. My hope is that we get to a point where we can start giving data about other parts of our business, again, seamlessly, so it feeds into our Oracle system, whatever system that might be, whether that's public data, private data. And if that data is then aggregated across all of the industry, hopefully it can start driving some more innovation around that as well. You know, there are some really good parametric products out there, but they're using what I assume is limited data from the information they can gather. If we've improved the speed, the accuracy, and the transparency, then we should be able to then start developing some more products that we can take to our risk guys and start saying, actually, we've got a way of transferring this risk to a third party. The last point on there, a bit more controversial, I think, is sort of sustainable industry. So we've seen over the past 2 years, 3 years, and in prior years as well, but certainly the spikes this current hard market around financial lines has been a really hard pill to swallow. It's very difficult for us to go to our CFO, CEO, stakeholders, and not just advise that premium has gone up by 100%, 200%, 500%, whatever it might be, but actually we might have gaps in our programs, we've got holes, we've got larger retentions, but with very little notice leading into it. The brokers did a great job in advising when they could, but my hope is that if we've got aggregated data, so claims data and risk data for the whole of the industry, these trends should start appearing earlier. And if we can do that, it allows us to then start developing our risk appetite strategy at an earlier stage as well. So if we know we've got 2 or 3 years lead up time to a market which is starting to change, we can then take a considerate view about whether we use the captive or we retain the risk. But we have time and the analytics behind it to be able to support us with that. It's very difficult to do that if it's just on a couple of months' notice. And the last point I've made there is around the secure transfer of data as well. Certainly the onboarding process that I've been through with Rob has highlighted that data security is key for businesses these days. And it's not just PII, it's corporate data as well. There was a lot of hurdles for us to go through just to get onboarded with Big Ticket, because our business wanted to make sure that we knew exactly who was using our data, what it was being used for, and where it was going. But if I reflect on how we're doing at the moment with insurance, it is simply, we have a spreadsheet. If you've got a RIMS platform, that's fantastic, but a lot of the stuff is just done via emails, where it's spreadsheets, proposal forms, Word documents, which we'll send to our broker, which will then get passed to insurers, to reinsurers, to third parties. We might have the odd NDA in place, and we've got SLAs with our brokers, but fundamentally, we're working in a very different space. And I do think at some point, the data protection officers are going to take a look at how we're sharing data and start asking some questions. Whereas if we've got a secure platform that allows us to be able to seamlessly transfer it, but with an agreement up front, I think that will really help us as well.
That's great, Lee. Thank you very much indeed. So we're focused initially with Lee and his colleagues and peers on exposure data, the golden thread that ties the industry together, and focused initially on property. But that's really the beginning here. So how does Big Ticket help Lee achieve some of the objectives and solve some of the pain points that he's been talking about? Well, there's one is purely around technology. So we essentially offer Lee and every other industry actor a single API to connect to the entire industry. Classic infrastructure, one connection point, no bilateral connections. Secondly, we offer Lee the chance to share exposure data friction-free in a way that allows you to consume that exposure data into your schemas without any operational change. For Lee, we can take his major pain point, this slightly ridiculous process of gathering exposure data every year. We can take that down initially by 50% and then to 0. On top of that, we can offer Lee insights from the industry, from Oasis partners, from insurers, from reinsurers and brokers, delivered digitally as part of workflow. The other key issue here is the ability to collaborate. So what we allow Lee to do is to collaborate with his supply chain, to open the firewalls, to share insights and look at common issues that affect them all. And essentially what we're trying to do here is foster digital innovation across the supply chain, brokers, insurers, reinsurers, and insurtechs as well, backed by bank-grade permissioning and data security, because a lot of the work that we've done here is really informed by open banking, where I spent the last couple of years working. So that's what we do there. But let me just give you a couple of examples of what the future could look like. So if I take where we are today, Horizon 1, essentially what Lee and his colleagues are doing are saying, look, we'll maintain the exposure data on behalf of the entire industry, a self-serve model. Not only that, we'll improve the data quality, a Japanese type manufacturing model, Kaizen, where the quality actually takes place at the front of the production line, not the back of it. That in aggregate across all business lines would save the insurance industry $25 billion a year, every single year, which is a staggering figure when you think about it. It's about 3% of GWP. However, that's really the start. Where we're going quite quickly is this idea that Lee said about data held within ERP systems. That data is available in real time, and we can start to move to a model where Lee and others can share that with data permissioning, with data security, with the industry to develop new products, to measure exposure in real time, to optimize modeling, to optimize reinsurance, optimize capital, all of those good things. And then we get into a situation of collaboration between peers, because what our platform does, it allows corporates to collaborate with corporates, it allows brokers to collaborate with brokers, insurers to collaborate with other insurers as well, and with insurtechs. So it's a platform that essentially allows any endpoint to collaborate with any other endpoint. And we think that's a real platform for digital innovation across the industry, which is, I think, why Dickie is so excited about it. And I must confess, I do share his excitement and enthusiasm as well, as you can probably hear from my voice. So where are we today? So we launched this business, the tech is built, it's operational, and essentially we're working with key partners both in North America and Europe in direct markets launching this quarter. We're focused on direct markets because we believe if exposure data is digitized in direct markets, then we can pass that data seamlessly to reinsurers as well. And we're already working with a terrorism reinsurer on that very point today. We're going to be holding a series of industry briefings, which will get much more technical than this in coming quarters with Oasis, and you will all receive information about how you can participate in that and understand how it affects your particular function or your particular business as well. But you can always reach out to me directly or the other members of the team who are also here today if you'd like to find out more. I hope that's justified Dickie's billing, and I suspect we'll find out from the questions or not whether it has. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Okay, gentlemen, I got probably one for you, Rob. One question online, actually 2 questions now. Yep. One of them is, does Big Ticket also work with multiple territories, writers, and reinsurance? You've partly answered that.
Yes. I mean, as you say, our ambition, it's not without ambition. Let's face it, what I described is not straightforward. I wouldn't quote John F. Kennedy's, we don't do this because it's easy, we do it because it's difficult. But we are starting with property, Dickie, and we are looking at this golden thread of exposure data from corporate to insurance broker, to insurer, to reinsurance broker, to reinsurer, and then out into an ILS marketplace if necessary. So we are looking at that entire chain. It's global in scope, for sure, because we're supporting businesses like Lee, who's in 10, 12 countries around the world. So yes, we are.
There is a question on the funding model for this. I don't know how much detail you can at this stage or want to go into.
Well, initially it was me and my co-founders. we funded
Actually, so let me clarify the funding model about how.
I'm putting it back. Okay. I'm putting it back. We're working with brokers and insurers about how the funding model works, but fundamentally it's free to any corporate anywhere in the world. And that is the key point. I come back to, the industry basically gets the benefit of corporates maintaining exposure data for them. So for us, that's a golden principle all the way through this.
Any question? Oh, there's a question.
Obviously, a big challenge for the industry is that kind of cleansing of data. Do you bring forward the corporate data in a standard format that's kind of cleansed already and sort of standardized, or is that sort of something for the industry to figure out after?
No, we present back to the corporate the previous year's data already cleansed and standardized in a way that allows the corporate essentially to, or let's use Lee in this case, Lee to distribute that data across his organization, to get visibility on how that process is taking place, that embeds tools to improve data quality, that gives the broker and the insurer visibility on that process across their portfolio, because brokers and insurers are managing expensive people at key choke points like 1231. And to allow that data to seamlessly come back into broker underwriter exposure management systems. So our technology at the center of that enables that to happen with data permissioning, and essentially allows an insurance broker to digitize the entire exposure collections process. So that's the aim, that's the objective here. So, in terms of our modeling with brokers and clients, in terms of direct marketplace, we take out mid-teens direct operational cost savings, for example, as well as improving Lee's world by 50%. And that's just a start.
Sorry, and so do you then have your own data standard that you insist they use, like OED, or do you kind of take it in whatever they want to provide you, and then you figure that out at the back end?
We reverse the polarity. What we do is we take data from an insurer's system that's already been cleansed and standardized to whatever schema format they're using. We take that out. We basically convert that back into plain English for Lee's benefit. We allow then Lee to maintain that data in plain English. We then convert that back to the schema format of insurer X, Y, and Z. So they don't have to conform to a standard. However, we are basically centered on OED. Now, at this particular point, in an audience of technical experts, I'm about to get way out of my depth. So if you want to explore that topic further, I'd be delighted to do so. I'd refer you on to Tim Bird, who's our head of product, who can explain that in much more precise language than my 65,000-foot view.
I mean, maybe I can just add that. I mean, I think certainly this is a sort of, we're still in early stages. But the point is that as the ability to converge, what you're building is this smart, intelligent platform that can do all sorts of things. So actually under the hood, it could maintain multiple data standards if it's in the short term required, right? But inevitably, I think what's going to happen, I would suggest what's going to happen is that OED will permeate through the system and into the corporates and back out again, so that it just becomes the lingua franca that we all use to be able to understand about exposure and use those in models around the world. That is that's sort of what happened in other types of system. It's what sort of, you've had Swift on your screen earlier on. It's what Swift has essentially done. It sort of makes sense, but you've got the flexibility to handle different things.
Yeah, I mean, the exciting thing is that our key partners, this is sponsored at CEO level, Chief Underwriting Officer level, Chief Financial Officer level. It obviously reflects into the exposure management community as well, but I think there's a recognition that this has to change. And frankly, what we do is very, very simple. It's technically quite complicated, but conceptually, it's very, very simple. So I haven't come across a single executive or underwriter that's turned around and said, that's a great idea. I want to do this. So we're literally 100% sign-up rate in terms of corporates and also brokers and also insurers working with us, which is very exciting because we're not trying to do anything that's being done today. That's the beauty about it. We're not trying to eat anybody's lunch. We're not trying to be anything that exists today in the insurance space.
There's a question from the back.
The technology, I suspect, I don't know, but distributed ledger technology? No blockchain? Can you explain what your thoughts are around that?
I was fortunate enough to work with a specialist financial technology investor, and we've spent a lot of time in the open banking space and looking at DLT technologies, over the last few years. The trouble with DLT is it requires everybody to move in lockstep in terms of moving to that new platform. Our solution here doesn't require anybody to change anything. And we think that's one of the great secrets to global adoption. So I think there are certainly opportunities to introduce DLT further down, but today to solve this first use case to get the digital connectivity in place, we don't think it's necessary.
What technology are you using right now?
As you'd expect, it's cloud-based. Again, I'm not going to go any deeper than that because our CTO here, Angad, if you'd like to chat about that, super delighted. But it's, as you would expect, it's scalable, elastic, data permissioned, all the words that Angad has taught me how to say. But I'll pass that back to him to elaborate on that later on.
Question from over here. The microphone's on its way, Ole. I know you've got a loud voice, but don't worry, it'll be better this way. Trust me.
Yes, we are in Ruschlikon. There's an initiative called Ruschlikon initiative that goes about transferring treaty information and other things which should go along with the exposure data. Are you involved in that? And have you had discussions how to implement that as well?
Not directly. We'd be very happy to get engaged in anything that helps move the industry forward in that regard. As I say, our primary focus is on, there are about 350,000 businesses in the world that employ more than 250 people that basically fuel the commercial insurance industry, both in the direct market, but also into the reinsurance market. So we're really focused on that group, trying to improve the customer experience for Lee. Because if you think about this as a pyramid, or if you like me, you like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, okay? So a good customer experience for the corporate is like air. We don't get anywhere unless they want to participate in this. Efficiency is like water. It's the second level of the pyramid. We need to drive a more efficient process through this exercise. Third piece is around data quality and innovation, because that's the space that we all want to get to, but you can't get there unless you hit those first two layers to begin with. So that's why we start with the corporates. That's why we start with the direct marketplace. And we see secondary markets, both wholesale like E&S and then reinsurance is benefiting from that digitization process downstream.
So Rob, I've got a couple more online questions here. Sure. Is Big Ticket a licensed intermediary?
No. No, we're not. We're not seeking to be any type of industry actor. Just to be crystal clear, nothing that we do conflicts with any other industry actor here. The only thing I haven't mentioned, and the reason MasterCard's a major investor, is at some point we want to look at the payments pain point that exists in the primary marketplace. To give you an example, for a large corporate client like Lee, it can take up to 2 years and 10,000 individual emails to reconcile and pay a single global property program. And I'll let you reflect on that. That is not unusual. That's the norm. Yeah. And when you look at our industry, and you look at the amount of times that money turns over, we're $1 trillion business now. My slide is out of date. It was 835, it's now $1 trillion. Actually, the payments piece is about $5 to $7 trillion of gross dollar volume gets turned over by the industry every single year through primary contracts into reinsurance contracts, etc. So that's the only other area, Dickie, that I haven't touched on.
Okay, I've got another question here, which is Big Ticket a competitor of PCS in the US or Perils in Europe?
No.
Excuse you. Is it just property or any line of business?
going back to the point, if one's going to build infrastructure, you've got to start somewhere. We start with property because it's a global homogeneous process for corporates. It's a global homogeneous pain point, and you know the industry is reasonably well advanced. With that goes terrorism. Next, we will be looking at cyber, and then we will be looking at other lines of business that are increasingly regionalized. So obviously, cyber, like property, is global in nature. Yeah? So that's where we start first. And going back to Lee's point, it is perverse that the industry sends out cyber security questionnaires in open emails, with spreadsheets, with no encryption, and you just reflect on that. At some point, that's going to come home to roost, And so, we think that cyber, just by its very nature, requires us to go there next.
Any more questions? Oh, there's one down the back.
I mean, concretely, so far, I mainly understood that you're collecting exposure data, and you can kind of store and centralize that. My next thought is, what about all the data that typically we acquire from companies like Moody's? That sounds like something that would be nice to have centralized by the industry.
I'll give you an example. So we work with Dun & Bradstreet. So basically allows people to consume Dun & Bradstreet data seamlessly as part of a process, rather than having to build their own interface, for example. So Moody's would be the same piece. It's about the interoperability. It's about how do you consume the data, how do you share it, and it's based around the concept of data permissioning. So Lee permissions his data, to his broker. The broker permissions it with the primary insurer, for example. If the primary insurer wants to offer Lee a risk insight back around a particular risk or hazard, digitally, they permission it back to the broker and onto Lee. So if you think about a service provider, one of the folks at the back here, for example, they'll have a commercial relationship with a broker or a corporate that does that. But I think there's another key point, which I probably should have brought up out here. We never see the exposure data. Big ticket is like a Cisco. It's the plumbing. We never see the data. There's no data lake here. There's no big data play. We're not a Facebook. We're a Cisco. So the data is permissioned by the corporate to the industry. Insights in the industry are permissioned back. So that's the model we're developing here. Again, it's basically based on where banking's gone in the last 5 years and where we think the regulator's going to go in insurance in the next 5 to 10 years as well.
That was helpful. Thanks.
Thanks.
One more there if you want.
I can't read it.
Sorry, can't you? Oh, well, I was trying to be subtle. That failed. So do you see yourself as a competitor for Origami or some others?
No, Origami and Inventive and Risk Connect are partners in our mind. The reason we say that, Dickie, is Origami, Inventive and Risk Connect are very sophisticated RIMS platforms. If every corporate in the world had one of those platforms, we just API into those. That's our idea. A bit like APIing into an Oracle or something like that. So for those businesses that either can't have a RIMS platform or don't want a RIMS platform, we offer essentially an industry portal, as opposed to going to Zurich's portal, AIG's portal, Swiss Re's portal. You basically go one place and then it's shared. So that's the model here. So we're not developing software. We don't have a product. Our product is infrastructure. That's all we're about.
I know, and I think I think you've made this. Both of you have made this very clear. But I mean, the system that has worked for the last forever, whereby Lee and 10,000 other people like Lee around the world collecting this information, passing it through. It gets cleansed by the insurance broker, and then the insurance broker. Then the insurer cleanses it, and then the reinsurance broker goes, "It's not good enough for my clients." And then the reinsurer goes, "Yeah, but we have other requirements too." And that's just a ridiculous system. And I was in a meeting in New York a couple of years ago now, when somebody from Chubb, senior person from Chubb, said, "It's just taken us 3 months to take multiple spreadsheets, multiple tabs, and some PDFs from one of our bigger clients to convert it in something from which we can give them some insight about risk." It's like, what type of stupid system do we live in where that is still, the standard today? And what you're, have started to do and are talking about doing is so revolutionary, because you can just pick up the data like that, run a model like that, give different, and then all the interest, which I think Lee, you sort of referenced this, is your conversation with your broker and your carrier and a discussion about what it means for your company. And that's just almost so hard to have right now. It's a game changer, and I think that's why I think it's fantastic.
I'll give you a last thought, and this may be an amusing thought. I don't know if you guys remember, there's a film called Groundhog Day. This guy woke up and imagined he was leaving the same day again. With property insurance, it's almost like every building on the planet is rebuilt every year. That's the way the industry treats it. Yeah? And we have this process where we go around collecting the same information. A building built in 1955, guess what? It was built in 1955 last year, and it was built in 1955 this year. But the syndicated market that we work in and the fact that business moves around means there's no corporate memory here. So essentially what we're establishing here is a corporate memory for the industry, which allows it to take advantage of that fact that that building hasn't changed without having to go through the operational pain of trying to maintain that, forgetting about it when the business moves, and then trying to learn that information again when that business is reacquired 2 years later.
Rob, there's a couple more questions which we're not going to have time for, but I just thought maybe you could, and you've half done this, but there's some questions about, when it's fully operational, when what's the sort of timeline, and if there is an engagement model, what would you like to see?
It's operational today. We're onboarding clients today. We are going to be running some seminars with you, Dickie. Again, that will be much more technical to scratch that itch, which I suspect a lot of you have in this audience about, okay, how does it actually work? So we'll do that. In terms of reach out, my email address is rob@bigticketplatform.com. I'm here and very, very happy, Dickie, that we send the slides out with contact details after the event.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Thank you. Well, compared with last year, we're bizarrely on time and ready for Martin Bertogg to lead us into coffee. Martin's head of Nat Cat Perils here at Swiss Re. Thank you for your hospitality as always. We look forward to some words of wisdom after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dickie. And it's amazing to be here in front of this audience with also just following now Rob and Lee. I thought an excellent kind of sequence, as it highlighted for me what makes it so amazing for me. It's this thought-provoking kind of atmosphere of very different thought leaders than where we're typically exposed to in terms of cat modeling or just pure reinsurance. It's about our operating models, as we just before, well, how does this connect to the way we operate? I've met the other service providers, Re-Ask, Fathom in the background. You come in within 10 minutes, you have a good discussion, kind of adding you something. That's, I think, where, for me, Oasis is an asset where even just as a platform, without even using the technology, we can offer here a discussion platform. And that's also why I'm so happy to have you here. Thanks for coming, all these thought leaders in the industry and beyond that industry, if I just think of the industry in terms of insurance terms. It's a pleasure to host you here in this Center of Global Dialogue. That's actually the title we give this infrastructure we have here. And I think that's what we're having here. That's what Oasis is inspiring us for. So thanks for being part of that and sharing your time with us. And probably also, Dick, you said I'm leading into the coffee break. Yes, I don't want to stand here for too long, to not hold you up also from that coffee break, which I think for me in these events is one of the most important integral parts of exchanging with other colleagues. So maybe I can give you a few, is it provoking or at least thought-inspiring thoughts as well, more from a, I call it now reinsurer's perspective. A practitioner, also a bit nervous here right now, I have to admit, and maybe I was surprised. I checked a bit if people are just looking at their gadgets, as probably many of you are aware, with this Hurricane Ian now probably in these maybe even minutes making landfall in Florida. So nervous times, at least for an industry practitioner we have. So amazing that I also got a slot here, which as a host is sometimes a bit easier to get that one. But I'm also excited it's from two angles. And some of this excitement, that's kind of my key message, kind of the key intent I have here to kind of share with you is we had about nearly exactly ago this first productive release of an Oasis built model within our framework. Michi was mentioning before. So we heard already it's Earthquake China. It's productive. It works. A very different standing compared to years ago. We're just thinking we have plans, we want to, there's ambitions, but now it's done. So super excited also seeing how it came to that point. You've seen already a bit of that story. And secondly, kind of exciting, it's also there's an industry context. We tend to think about modeling and tech and platforms and Azure and cloud and all this, but there is this business reality as well, and Hurricane Ida is probably one of these kind of signals, reminding us that this modeling is not done as an academic art or an academic bubble. And I will share a few thoughts just from my seat's perspective, hopefully adding to the dialogue. Dickie mentioned strategic risk, which I thought it's a great point to make here also in terms of CAT modeling as getting it right. I think, not sure accuracy was a topic on these word clouds we've seen. Also think of what's happening right now. We need to get it right. And I think we need to get it more right. For some of you might also claim it when it comes to modeling, when it comes to risk adjustment, risk assessment, but also to the pricing of all these risks. So that's the strategic risk. And one part of that is also kind of the workflow, the procedures, and that's where Rob and Lee is opening kind of new angles on how can we deal with data, but also how can we deal with modeling, risk assessments, and this co-creation thought we've seen on GEM models, Hannover, Swiss Re, some of the brokers collaborating, quite amazing kind of in terms of creating a new ecosystem, just a new way. It's not just another model. And that's the key reason why we are there and supporting that. If I may, I have probably the slide control somewhere. Who stole it? Huh? No. So the topics, the first two bubbles here probably reflect a bit on that strategic risk. And the third one is more sharing my excitement around what we can do on that risk modeling platform to address some of these strategic risks. Since now 5.5 years, we are bombarded with quite a bit of Nat Cat activity. So are we ready to act on all these wake-up calls? And the one just happening right now, this question of is CAT modeling good enough? Is it fit for purpose? And then look at the opportunity. So that's roughly kind of what I want to go through. It's a bit of a busy slide. We recently used an investor, actually a Monte Carlo, so it's an official Swiss Re slide. And there's quite a bit of dense information. I know now probably people try to read. I just like to highlight 2 points of it. This connects reasonably well what we've heard before. One is if look at this graph, and I'm not sure if I'm able, probably I cannot display really something. The key insights, it occurred to me at some point, and then I think more and more people also joined in seeing that there's this blue curve showing the 10-year average of natural catastrophe insured losses over the last 50 years. So the blue line in between. And you see there, it's not super visible, it's this dip. It starts in 2012. To 2016, the whole globe experienced a strong dip in natural catastrophe activity. Insured losses were at probably historic low in absolute terms as well. That's probably many of you are aware. That's also where all this alternative capital, cat bonds came online. And it was very easy to generate new capital in the industry. The market was softening. Well, then 2017 was this big turning point. There, I got often this question internally, particularly in 2017, 2018. Well, is this now climate change hammering us? Is this a new normal, a new world we are exposing? If I look at this chart, and that's for me that message, well, we had that dip, which created somehow strong, wrong incentives on one hand side, but it also, if you look at the blue curve with just a bit more distance, it's quite a steady curve. There's a steady growth, and there is a number mentioned there of 5 to 7%. If you take the last 20 years, about 5 to 7% of annual growth in figures. That's inflation adjusted, but not adjusted for anything else. That's just how this risk cake is growing. And it has been growing. Just we got 5 years of respite, and the industry, in our view, is still in a digestion mode of kind of this 5 years of respite. What does that mean? How far back do we go in looking at history to tell forward-looking on how a risk assessment has to look like? So my call is to think of this growth, kind of also embed more forward-looking perspective. The second topic, and that's probably to the point that it becomes a nuisance, is the question of secondary perils, a word which in the meantime some people start to hate as it's very imprecise. I'm not 100% sure, but probably 95% sure that we coined it in Swiss Re. I remember the discussion, I was even involved. And I remember at that time already, not a well-coined term. but somehow we just use it, and it was in the publication already, and now everyone uses it. And I think the spirit of it is quite clear of what it means. And when you come to modeling here, of where we're sitting, I think the secondary perils is an important asset or an important topic. For key perils like earthquake and windstorm, I think the whole industry, and that's not about the models, but the industry uses modeling, the infrastructure, data we heard, in a reasonable, controlled spirit across the whole value chain. As soon as you drop to hail, flood, very often wildfire, as this value chain breaks down. Hardly any exposure data there. Models, while available all across, not really shared actively, not being asked for. So a very different way of people dealing with that specific risk. And our call there is clear. Think of exposure data connecting well again to Rob and Lee. Think of exposure data for other perils than just these key perils. Use the models and also share that models across the value chain, not having everyone kind of reinvent kind of what does it mean, this specific peril. So that's the two asks I have here from that specific slide. Why is this important? And this is maybe very much my perspective as being a reinsurer. I'm sure many of you also noted that report last October, so nearly a year ago. It made quite some headlines, at least within the insurance world. If S&P, kind of the most diligent observer of the reinsurance performance, capital position, kind of comes up with this conclusion and saying probably the reinsurance industry by and large is undercosting by 30 to 50% the business it's getting in. And clearly the stakes are high, 6 years or 5.5 years, so not perfect performance. There's reasons to engage more into modeling, data collection, and make that a robust foundation. And that's where I'm just using a sentence now to kind of capture a bit my excitement around the opportunities we have in that space. Oasis, OED, and GEM, and we heard about other assets coming in this probably more public domain environment. They're already made. You heard it, how reasonably easy it was to get this China earthquake model running. Certainly for me, kind of sitting in the chair and more listening to the results was very easy. There were a few hurdles to take, but it was not unsurmountable hurdles. And I heard a lot of the help, be it on the GEM colleagues side, the Oasis side, to make it run. And now it's running. And this comfort of number one is done. Number 2, 3, 4, that will be followed quite quickly. GEM is the other asset I want to point out here, which makes me so excited. At this point, even more the Oasis, as we're a bit more advanced. So Earthquake China is our 4th model. We are building more or less on GEM input, so very strongly relating to that. It's such a precious asset you get, and it's so different to many, probably a super contrast to the typical thing that if you get something, I'm not saying cheap, but at the lower price tag, it typically also has lower quality. But GEM is exactly the opposite. You find more efficiency and you get the best out of what you want to have for the earthquake model. Amazing. Co-creation was the other topic where I heard Hannover's colleague, us collaborating, few of the brokers as well. Just the energy you create there, kind of that the industry builds a foundation where you can build more trust in what these models produce. And this is important if you look at what I described before, where do we get it right? Are the models good enough? So again, this mix of assets here kind of portraying rather a new workflow than just a new model. For me, an invitation, big invitation to just join that movement. And that's my key message eventually, kind of join us here. We have many colleagues here as well. Interact with us. I'm happy to offer time from us, also for people who are on board and can get on that journey. It probably needs a bit of courage for this first step, but maybe you don't have the perfect environment to make it fit. We didn't have either, but we managed with determination. Now we're encouraged to do more. So that's all I had to share. I hope kind of you reach out, knock on our doors, and become also part of this productive usage community of Oasis, GEM, the whole mix, and OED as well. Thanks.
Martin, thank you. So if you're in the room, we have half an hour of coffee about outside. If you're online, thank you. We'll be back with you in about half an hour. Thank you all very much.
Can you slowly take the seats, please? Don't want to interrupt too much the interactions, but We have another opportunity to network, connect afterwards. So after the session, we have then also apéro outside where you get some drinks and you can walk around the stands and further connect. So yeah, please continue the dialogue. As mentioned earlier, that's a very important part of the conference. And it's also great to see how much you connect and now slowly get back to your seats. So now I would like to introduce you to the next session. It's about unmodeled losses, the challenges for cat modeling. We have the session split in 3 different parts. We have first presentation from Erich Fischer. He's a senior scientist and lecturer at the ETH of Zurich. Followed by another presentation from Thierry Corti. He's the climate change lead within Swiss Re and Swiss Re Institute. Then we have a panel discussion where where Erich Thierry will join, and in addition we have Ivan Stalder, head of group accumulation at Zurich, join. Tom Philipp, the CEO of Maximum Information, moderated by Judith Cerda Belmonte. Who will then moderate that panel discussion. So, Erich, I would like to welcome you, or all of you welcome you on the stage, and then Erich for your presentation.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to talk about extremes from a climate scientist perspective. So I want to talk about some of the frontiers we try to address currently in climate science and give sort of an external perspective. I also want to give you a couple of glimpses on the project, which I listed here, XAIDA, which stands for Extreme Events at Artificial Intelligence Index Attribution. So we try to bring in together in this project the big developments in the 2 worlds of artificial intelligence and climate modeling. And the other project where I'm a PI from the ETH Zurich side, which is like XAIDA, funded by the European Commission, is the project Next GEMS. So John, don't be nervous. We're not claiming that we can build the next earthquake model. This is about the next generation Earth system models, where we try to go a step beyond and create the first storm resolving model together with ECMWF, the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, where we run 4-kilometer atmosphere model coupled to a 2.5-kilometer global ocean model, and try to resolve a lot of the processes that are so far unresolved in these global models. So the goal here is actually to go and resolve phenomena that we basically cannot in the traditional general circulation model, and run these models for several years, out to 30 years. That's the goal at the end of the project in 3 years from now. But I want to start and give you sort of an idea of what we're thinking in terms of extremes in a changing climate. And basically, the last few weeks and months, the headlines were full from these pictures, right? Starting this summer with the very hot conditions very early on in India and Pakistan, temperatures way above the normal at a stage, basically very much before the onset of the monsoon, followed by a very exceptional summer, as you know, in Europe, where many of the riverbeds, like here in Loire, were completely dry. I could also mention Po Basin and others. Temperatures of unprecedented levels, 40 degrees in the UK, and we have very long observations. So this is basically a temperature that has never been observed in the UK. Then also large parts of China facing a very, very persistent series of heat waves and dry conditions, and in other places, very heavy rainfall events. And as you know, lately, then the Pakistani flood that were basically affecting a large fraction of the country. So one of the obvious questions we always get from the media is, what is the role of climate change in all of this? And we basically try to address this and answer this question in the IPCC AR6 report, where I also contributed as a lead author, and we came up with this very strong language, I think, where we argued it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change and also making extreme events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts more frequent and severe. So here, basically, we have made a substantial step forward, but it's important to remember that we were only able to make this statement when aggregating, averaging, pooling across large regions. At the same time, if it comes to the local scale, we obviously know that variability, the chaotic internal variability of the climate system is enormous. And that's very important. And I know that many of you are aware, but that's important to always remember. What I try to illustrate this with what is a 3,500 year long simulation from a global climate model. And per definition, there's no climate change in this because we keep everything fixed. We do this as a test bed, but the top of atmosphere energy balance is completely stable. And we're looking at heavy rainfall at one grid point, right? And you see there's a lot of variability. I can actually zoom in and show you 1 century where there's only one event that reaching a certain threshold. The numbers here, by the way, are relatively low because we're averaging over a quite large grid cell, so you can wonder how realistic this is. But it's just to illustrate the challenge here we're facing, because we can take another century where we exceed this very same threshold 17 times. And this is not climate change. This is by construction, simply long-term variability. Obviously, I have been picking the 2 centuries where this, to make this point very strongly here. And also, if you again average over larger regions, then these things would tend to somewhat cancel. But it's very important to remember here. It's also important to remember that climate change has an effect on these phenomena I mentioned before, but there's sort of a different strength. There's different confidence in those changes, and actually basically different levels of signal to noise ratio, starting with the temperature extremes where we have very good understanding. Even if nothing else changes than the background climate, these events, heat waves, cold waves, change in a warmer climate. To some extent, the same applies to heavy rainfall event and droughts, because warmer air can carry more moisture, can also evaporate more moisture from the surface. So we have a good understanding that heavy rainfall and droughts are also changing, but there are other elements that make these already much more complicated. And if it comes to those last smaller elements, convective storms, extratropical cyclones, a lot of these phenomena many of you are interested in, we see actually the confidence gets low, and it often also implies that actually that signal to noise ratio becomes smaller and the variability often becomes dominant, right? So we make these statements, but we also make statements in the latest IPCC reports about unprecedented events. So a lot of the research of the last 2 decades in climate science has been going in the direction of, if we use the analogy of the loaded dice, there are more 6s on the loaded dice. But a question we always get is whether we also need to think about events that have been impossible without climate change. Those 7s on the loaded dice, if you want to take this analogy a step further. So we often actually, less from insurance, but often from very critical infrastructure, like nuclear safety, nuclear power plant safety, we get questions like, what is the highest possible event? If I really want to be very resilient to the most extreme case you could possibly think of, what is that level, right? And we started to think about it. It's a very challenging question, right, as you could think. I think a good start is temperature, because there is sort of a good understanding that there are some physical limits to temperature. There's very good reasons why we've never observed 70 degrees or even 65 degrees somewhere on planet Earth due to natural conditions. Right? So we started with this, and what you're looking at here, just to outline the problem, is a time series from a climate model. So it's much longer than you typically have from observations. It goes back to 1850, just for illustration purposes. And it shows you how the temperature of the hottest week per year could vary over a period of 170 years. And there is actually relatively little trend in these time series, which is actually also the case for the observations. So you could be tempted to say, okay, well, we come up with some high return level, and maybe we want to be on the safe side and take the upper bound of this confidence interval. Is this a good estimate for the highest possible event we should be prepared for? I'm showing you what's happening in this particular realization of the climate model a couple of years after. We suddenly get a spike, a temperature surge, which goes way, way, way beyond anything that has been previously simulated. I do admit, when I saw this point in my first graph, I thought this was an error in the post-processing of the climate model output, right? So I looked into the model and looked at the processes that actually led to this event in the model and started to realize, okay, at least in a model context, it is real. So there is a high pressure system. There are very dry soils, exceptional combination of these conditions. We thought, how can this actually happen? If we think that actually climate change is sort of a gradual process, so we thought, okay, we need to better understand and run the model over and over again. And that's what we did. So we often work these days with these sort of initial condition experiment. And you could try to find the difference here and stare at these two simulations. So we often induce a tiny perturbation, which you would not notice for the first 10 days or so. But then after a while, they give you a completely different realization of weather. And after a couple of months, they give you a different realization of climate. And then we compared about this. And this is the exact same model run 84 times. And then we basically can better quantify how these return levels change. And what you see is actually gradually changes. So it just happened that the realization we were looking at, and obviously I've been picking that one to make the point, has been sort of hiding the climate change signal. And sometimes we think, okay, we've always been talking about this climate change signal, but it doesn't appear in the data. I think this is exactly when we start to get a little nervous, because this is sort of, again, internal variability of the climate system. In this case, has been hiding the change, and then suddenly we got this surge behavior. So what I call a record shattering event. So we wrote a paper about it. I can tell you we had quite a hard time to get it through review because people did not doubt that this is relevant, but I said the probability of having this type of event is very low. We argued, yes, that's true for one given point, but if you look at the probability of getting somewhere on the northern hemisphere, it actually is a considerable probability to have this. And then, by coincidence, literally within the 2 weeks of when this paper appeared, the Pacific Northwest heat wave happened. And it was exactly the type of event we were talking about, right? Exactly the type of behavior that is now observed. Temperatures almost 5 degrees above what has been previously observed. And this, again, is basically something, if you sort of do a naive fit of extreme value theory on the period up to that event, you would actually sort of miss. So people told me you've been lucky, right, by publishing the paper exactly in terms of communication, because we got covered by Washington Post, New York Times, and everything, right? But in principle, actually, this summer, we could have taken almost any month and see this type of spike behavior. In March, in Antarctica, where no one really cared because there was very little impact, I guess, in Sacramento a couple of weeks ago. And then we also see sort of glacier melt, Greenland ice sheet melt. But what you notice is all these events are directly related to temperature, thermodynamic, right? And this is still quite remarkable if you think about it, because it's very simple statistics. Records, the longer we measure, they should become rarer and rarer, right? A good analogy is long jumping. The long jumping world record dates back from the 1960s and were only hardly beaten, marginally beaten by Carl Lewis in the 1990s by a few centimeters. Because so many students, high school students, tried it and never got even close. And at this point, it's very, very hard to beat that record, right? Because so many people have tried it. And if someone would come now and jump half a meter further than anyone before, highly suspicious, right? That person must be doped. But these things are currently happening in the climate system, at least in terms of temperature. So we wanted to understand this. And we tried to look at other incidents all across the globe. And you actually see that these records, and this is a coverage by Bloomberg of our maps of records, you see actually these records have been broken all over the place. And the same is even more pronounced in 2018. So we tried to do this mathematically. I spare you the details here, but what we basically can show is that this behavior, the fact that we see so many records in this period now, relates to the fact that we are in a period of very, very rapid warming, following a period with relatively little warming. So up to the 1960s, 70s, we had relatively little warming, and we basically are in a period where the warming picks up. If we are able to somewhat slow down the warming or even stabilize the warming, this record behavior is going down again, right? Even though we're going to see more frequent events, that notion of record breaking is becoming rarer and rarer. So one question we were basically trying to address in the, and I'm talking about in the very last few slides, is, isn't it frustrating that we always need to sit and wait to see what the next of these records occurs, right? Can we actually sort of quantify this type of worst case that we should be expecting? And this, I think, is particularly relevant for very critical infrastructure. And I'm not talking about predicting at the timescale of weeks or days. I'm really asking the question, could we basically have told people in the year 2020 in Canada, the province of British Columbia or the state of Washington, that this is something you need to take into account? And we were clear that this is going to be very hard because these are very unlikely events. Estimating the probability is difficult, so we went down a route which is called, becomes more and more popular in climate science, called physical climate storyline. It's sort of a trajectory of an event, if you will, a worst case event, and you don't necessarily are able to attach a proper probability, but I think it's very useful for stress testing of energy system or any other human system. So we addressed the question, could we have told people in the year 2020 by running climate model, could we have estimated what really occurred? That's the black curve here. You see the anomaly of the heat wave that has been observed in 2021. And those dashed curves are simulation that we produced by looking for the most extreme cases in this particular area. And we come close. In some cases, we even go beyond. And at that point, we were wondering, could things have turned out even more extreme? So we come up with an estimate, basically in a methodology in which we restart the climate model. So we pick that one of the most extreme cases, and we sort of try to, what we call ensemble boosting, we sort of try to push the model to its most extreme possible state to actually start to understand what are these processes that sort of prevent temperatures to actually exceed a certain threshold. And you see that actually we can get quite efficiently more intense event, and we can even go in and study the processes. So the one to the left is what's observed, the one to the right are those storylines, which I could not exactly give you the return period before the event, but we could show these events can happen, right? So we're further working on this now and apply this for all type of other events. It's important basically as a first conclusion, because people have been questioning whether things are evolving more rapidly than we sort of anticipated. I don't think we have much evidence for that. I think we could have drawn these dots where we for the Pacific Northwest heat wave already in the year 2020 with existing climate models. We use the same approaches to address many kind of other complex events, like compound events with common drivers, co-occurring extremes across the Northern Hemisphere, multivariate extremes, multi-year droughts, and so on. This is all work we're currently addressing with these type of methodology. So I'm stopping here. I think we do need to prepare for events of unprecedented intensity, particularly because internal variability is very large, and if it's superimposed to a slow-moving trend, it can actually bring about surprises. And that we are particularly in a period where we have very rapid warming, where we should expect to see many of these events. And I think this type of new storyline approach is quite attractive to explore and understand the physical processes behind this event. And I'm finishing one of the visualization of that next generation Earth system model. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. So we take the questions and afterwards in the panel. So directly hand over to Thierry for your part.
Yeah, thank you a lot, and thanks for having me here. It's really a pleasure to talk here for many reasons. I mean, not just because I'm a Nat Cat modeler at heart still, even though my title doesn't include Nat Cat anymore, which is a bit of a shame. It's going back to my old days as a climate scientist. What I want to talk to you about is it's about advancing Nat Cat modeling at Swiss Re, a bit the more conceptual view. And I basically show you two slides. One is the at Swiss Re part, where I'm really glad that neither Beat nor Michi or Martin Bertogg showed the slide that I will show. And then about advancing Nat Cat modeling, a conceptual view. So the slide I want to show on why we're actually here is a slide we like to show to investors. And you don't need to read through it. I'll show you the three highlights from my point of view. So this is part of the slide deck we show to investors on sustainability and what our purpose is as a company. And you can find it on swissre.com, investors, presentation, and conferences. So it's not just me saying that Nat Cat modeling is important. It's also what we always say to our investors and to anyone who wants to listen. Nat Cat modeling is important to us because we see Nat Cat insurance or reinsurance as a key market. It's important to us. It's a market where we want to grow. And we want to grow because we think it's profitable and we think we understand it and we have the machinery. So on the left-hand side, you see, Nat Cat reinsurance is important to us, 20% of our premium income in the P&C reinsurance business. On the right-hand side, you see that we have the machinery, not just the modeling, but we have the seamless integration. So we take the modeling, the costing, we store it in the right systems, we do our risk management on top of that, we do this business steering on top of that. So we take a strategic approach to the business, which means that we take the strategic risk that we're always faced with that Dickie mentioned, we take this as a strategic opportunity to move forward. And in the middle, you see why we're here today, right? I mean, we have more than 40 scientists working on the models. We have even more IT experts working on it. We have you all here that are not from Swiss Re working with us. We have scientists like Eric Fischer working with us. So we have this exciting knowledge and machinery to also move forward. So when I now think about what we're actually doing, I want to start with the basics, and bear with me, right? I mean, you all know the four-box modeling concept, right? Hazard, vulnerability, exposure, financial modeling. It's something that I discovered personally about 15 years ago, when I thought, okay, that's how we're doing it. So let's take a probabilistic event set, some coding. Let's take a vulnerability engine. Let's ask all the engineers in the world what they're thinking. Exposure, it's great, you're right. We have let long nowadays. Let's use that. Let's describe every single location with all those modifiers we have. And then the end, okay, let's take a contract. and read the conditions, the wording, and let's make sure that we can reflect that too, right? As junior modeler, I was excited that we can do that. After a year, thought, okay, I've done it, I've seen it. Is that it, right? But of course, I realized, that if you, for instance, misunderstand the conditions you have in your contract, you might model for something that you will not pay for, or even worse, the other way around, right? You might miss the modeling. So already here, I realized it's great to work in a place like Swiss Re, where you actually do the business and do the modeling, so you can connect the two and not get missed out. And the other thing I realized is that you can take a hazard. It doesn't need to be probabilistic. It can also be a simpler hazard, right? You can take a vulnerability, a exposure description, and a financial model, and you can compute something. But that probably is not state of the art, and it probably puts you out of business quite quickly, because you need to make sure that your hazard is up to date, that all your components are up to date. And for me, when thinking about the hazard, I'm quite convinced that, or I'm sure that, climate change, wherever it matters, we're looking at it. I see it day to day in our modeling activities, right? And we're talking about, for instance, if you take Eric Fisher's talk, right? We're talking about climate change a lot, and there's tremendous work being done that we can take on board. It's quantitative. We have tons of data. So we take that data and we detrend our hazard, and we do everything we can to update it. So for me, that's now day-to-day normal business. The same goes thinking about flood protection, for instance, on vulnerability, updating building standards, observed building standards, not the one on paper, of course. Looking at urbanization trends, including demand surge, watching out for wording changes that have an impact on the actual modeling. So I think those are the things that make our work interesting. And since all those change over time, if you're outdated, your model will just not produce the right results anymore, which also means that we never can go home. We always have a job to do to update our models. So let's not get tired. And then, that's what I realized later. It's established practice. It's what we learned. Of course, if you look back to the 1970s, some of you might have been around back then. I haven't, but I can read the history books of Nat Cat modeling back then. And I realized those 4 boxes, you might yawn at them today, but they were exciting new stuff back then, or they have been invented at a point at least. So the established practices of including climate change, et cetera, I think those are complemented also today by things that are not so much standard practice. And the word of warning, when I started this graph, I thought, oh, that's easy, I fill it in. But then I realized that, of course, it depends on your peril, your region, your modeling, your business ambition, etc., what you consider established practice and what it's not so established. So, for instance, unmodeled subperils, in a modern tropical cyclone model, we have several subperils that we explicitly model. If you look at some secondary perils like hail, it's mainly just hail size that we look into. We don't even consider it's raining like hell at the same time, and we might have flooding with the hail. That's maybe also more a question of where you are, who you are, what you're doing. But still, what I put on here is that what's not so established from my point of view, where I see that we're investigating a bit more now, is topics like subsidence, increasing flood risks, exposure uncertainty. The data is not as good as we wish it was, and we had the talk today on that too. And then a topic like social inflation, supply chain disruptions, where we have some data, we have quite some understanding. It's just that, unfortunately, by the nature of it, we can't run social inflation models that give us a ton of data and are based on physical principles like we have climate models, right? It's human-driven processes. It's much harder to wrap our head around, especially for those of us like me who are natural scientists. It creeps me out typically to think of human processes and try to quantify them, right? Because I'd rather base something on physics rather than psychology or the next election that's coming up. And then below this, and that's also something we always look into, it's what I would call emerging risk factors. There's also always this or that more or less esoteric project that we run on the side where someone is looking into something that might turn out to be a nothing, right? A new risk factor, or maybe risk management asks us to look into something and we think, oh, okay, let's look into it, but it's not relevant. And maybe it's not relevant today, maybe it's not relevant in this market. And I didn't fill in any factors here that I think are emerging, because either they're outdated for some of you, or they're awfully esoteric for some of you, or then you think it belongs somewhere else. But I hope that in the panel afterwards we can discuss a bit, what we think is really at the edge of the risk factors that we're considering. And with that schematic, I want to leave you and just go back a bit and quote someone who shares the first name with me, but is much more important at Swiss Re, it's Thierry Léger, our Group Chief Underwriting Officer. He said recently that we do indeed see CAT or Nat Cat as an attractive area to grow further, which, I'm really excited about science, etc. So I don't need more motivation, but if I would need more motivation to be a Nat Cat modeler, then I would see this as one, right? I mean, there's so much focus at Swiss Re and in other players and here at this conference on advancing Nat Cat modeling to improve our risk view and to improve the standing that we have within the insurance industry. Thank you for that.
So now we start with the panel, and we have organized an interactive panel. This means that you can ask questions from now on. We already had two very, very interesting talks. I'm sure you have questions already there in the background, in your head. Please write them in a Slido. If you are here in the room, just put your hand up, and we will make it on real-time interactive. So in the meanwhile, because we have such an interesting panel today, full of experts. Next one sitting to Thierry is Ewald. I would like to ask to Ewald, in Zurich Insurance, how do you deal with climate change in the context of unmodeled risks?
Thank you. And before I go there, I just want to share that in my title, there used to be Nat Cat at some point in time as well, and it disappeared, right? So I don't know if this is a trend, but we see that as well. So of course we are affected by all this change, but also I think it's an opportunity to prepare for the unprecedented, in terms of what we do and where we come from with all the modeling. What really matters at Zurich is that we take a look at this in a very integrated way, so we don't have a standalone kind of thing. So we really kind of do this as part of what we have been doing. And yes, we call this the Zurich view, and it was triggered actually by another project, the next passion that we kind of share actually project with Swiss Re. Triggered by a commercial model that just didn't fit. And we looked at different models and we made an assessment and just take a call on what the right risk view is. So that was kind of the trigger to come up with a process that means bringing the ownership of the risk view and do this in an integrated way. If we can forward the slide, and I'm not going into a lot of the technical details, and thank you, of how we do that. I think it's very exciting. Learn from the general circulation models and to bring in hazards, to use AI and neural networks to project in the future and bring this back into event sets. I mean, this is a science by itself. It's very, very exciting and of course demanding, but it serves a good purpose because those changes are key to understand. just kind of focus very quickly. We have one planet, but also there is one risk view. There's one complete and accurate risk view. And the goal must be for those who put up the balance sheet of out to Mother Nature is to understand this. And I just listed a couple of things that all fall into that process of understanding. And I'm not going to drain the list, but we have seen all these non-modeled components. This shouldn't be there. We are not really in the business of producing gap models, but the gaps are reality. We should be filling all these gaps. Data quality has gone a little bit in the background. I think it's absolutely fundamental. There's a lot of difference that can be made there. So it's just something, again, that is part of the process. We shouldn't forget about it. And then, of course, the model validation. Again, it's a regulatory requirement today, but for those who put out the balance sheets, how fundamental is it to understand really what can come from any source, any peril, any region where we can be exposed into that? And as part of that, the whole thing starts to move. So we look at that as a new dimension, an additional dimension that also brings this time element into the future along that we shouldn't do standalone. I find it very challenging when we have companies doing that work and trying to bring the insight into our framework. It's almost impossible to connect. So we want to do this in an integrated way. Just on the next slide, very quickly. Thank you. Sorry. A little busy, but focusing on the left-hand side, we have these different use cases. At the bottom left-hand side, it depends a lot whether we do the underwriting, whether we do strategic portfolio management, or we do long-term investment. So it depends a lot on which use cases we are looking at. And you are today with the change that may happen already. Models typically focus on the reference period that go back a couple of years, and then we have these trends into the future, and of course uncertainty going there. But really the key point is that this climate analytics work into the future has helped us, despite all the uncertainty, to understand the risk today. So that's the most relevant in terms of the underwriting. What has changed already? Because we just cannot assume that that is all fully captured. So we need to understand the trend, bring that together with the historical claims data and bring it all together and ask ourselves, what actually has changed already? So that's the key part of what we do. Also, what we I think is very important is there's a lot of focus on the hazard. We need to connect the dots to the vulnerability and the exposure. And you have seen all this, the graph on the right-hand side, what really drives the risk. And we shouldn't forget about the vulnerability part, the exposure part, the adaptation that starts to come in. And just this week, I saw actually a presentation that starts to look at this adaptation and how vulnerabilities, how exposures are changing. And we need to bring that in and just be conscious of what's covered and what's not. So transparency on these assumptions is fundamental. So that was just kind of following up on the question. A couple of points I wanted to share to spark ideas, discussion. We want to keep this interactive. And we did bring a question or two. If we can bring up the Slido of the first question. I'm glad I have it here because that's a bit hard to read. So the first question for you today is, which of the following capabilities is the most important for insurance companies to understand natural catastrophe risk? Is it 1, data quality? Is it 2, take the ownership of the risk view apart from climate change? Is it 3, climate change analytics, scenario modeling? Is it 4, filling model gaps apart from climate change? And we let some time pass. It's already coming through, well, not as extreme as it appeared to be in the beginning. Yeah, data quality started very strong. Catching up again. And let me just check what I kind of ordered myself just before actually after joining the panel. And I think what's really in common is, yes, the data quality is a key part. I believe model validation itself as well. I would give both of those a very high importance. Filling model gaps is coming through as well. Maybe not, well, it's just going up again a bit. Yeah, but then the climate work, in the context of all these things may not be that important, which doesn't mean it's not important. I think the point here is that we cannot forget about all the rest. And we know all the challenges we have on the resource side and the squeeze. If we allocate resource to all this important climate work, we cannot forget about the other parts. And I think that's coming through very well here. Thanks for the feedback.
Well, thank you very much. Do we have any question from the audience? I cannot see anything in a Slido coming in. Do you have questions? Yes, please. Is it a microphone, please? Thank you.
Could we even argue that the second one, the ownership of the view of risk, is also kind of just a byproduct of the first one, because the model developers, both the exposure and the loss side, we have too little transparency there, and that's why there are too many gaps?
I think they are connected and related, and you could argue it's all related to some extent. But yes, I do support that view. Yes.
Mm.
I don't know if there's different opinions.
More questions? Yes.
I've got a sort of question. I was fascinated by that slide, because I think the first point on the slide about data management, well, essentially, if the vision from big tickets is fulfilled, that substantially, if not entirely, goes away, which is such a waste of time if we have to format data and reformat data and check on missing data and all that sort of stuff, which leaves some of the other ones. And I think that the model validation piece, when I've, in sort of a long period of time, look at the industry, I think, why is it that we have to fight so hard to find the information we need to validate these models? And we're just starting a process in Oasis to actually automate some of that process, so that actually you can look at the comparison, say, of a vulnerability function against some generic open vulnerability functions. And therefore, the goal of teams that you employ isn't to find out where the data is to do the initial work on the validation. It's to actually compare the results and say, that's within the right ballpark, I think that's okay. I mean, there's just so many efficiencies in those statements that we just should be, it's sort of not a question, obviously, but I just think, I hope we agree that there's so much more we can do to make the really interesting bits of our job, get back to being CAT modelers and not data scientists and technicians and everything else. But thank you.
Yeah. If I may respond to that, I think that's the exposure uncertainty is really something we need to get rid of, right? For me, what's worrisome is a bit more on the financial modeling side, or on, on the contract side, is that we seem to have contracts where there's a disagreement after the event, what the wording means, what exclusions means, and what the industry is supposed to pay for and what not. And that's something that keeps worrying me, governmental interference or social inflation, whatever name you want to give it. It's this uncertainty in the claims payment. I think that's maybe even a harder nut to crack. But I fear that before we can really go back to the natural science view and uncertainty and advanced modeling as we want to focus on what we love to do most, I think that's another block from my perspective, another uncertainty to remove.
Any more questions, please, from our audience here or our audience online? I don't see anyone from online asking. Okay, so then I would like to ask Tom. Tom is, I would say, the company he works for it fills a gap in the market, because we have a lot of pressure in understanding the models, in comparing them. We need more independent analytics, and also how to deal with the climate change on top of that. So I hope to see more of these companies coming in. It's only 2 years that he's working, that he's the CEO. It's only 2 years that this company exists, but I think that's a very good start, and hopefully we see more. And as I said, I would like that he explains also how he sees the climate change and also the unmodeled risks and what risks are coming in the future.
Great, thanks, Judith. I think I have a slide actually that, when it comes up, will help me. Yeah. So, I mean, it's very difficult to say anything new to the three sat on my left. Very illustrious panel and very, very eloquent panel. I promise if this slide had come up first, mind-blowing, but potentially a little bit. Still, I hope, hopefully. So maybe just wipe your brains and think of this. But frankly, having heard these three guys, this is a summary now, right, of what I think we've just heard. So the top line there, I think Thierry's got a great point that we still think very simplistically, you know, about risk being this function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability. My feeling would be that Thierry's very lucky to work at a huge company with a huge capability in risk modeling. I think most in the market still need help with understanding and being able to talk about this risk equation and actually then disaggregating it to make coherent narratives. But I think that for the unmodeled loss question, that coherent narrative is what we're trying to get towards. And coming to Ewald's point, it's actually the time horizon problem that I think we need to really focus on. Once we've almost got an access of what risk means, now what are we answering through time? And the way that I end up looking at it, interacting with clients in these first couple of years of being around the market, I would say we've got a few very challenging present day issues, a few in the midterm and a few in the long term. And I'm being very vague there, right? I'm not putting any time horizon, any actual absolute numbers on those time horizons. And I think it's up for debate what we can do. But in the present, I think actually there's an interesting one to the climate change question specifically. Climate change cuts across all three, makes it a very challenging thing to deal with. But without being explicit like this and thinking of it in these sort of time horizon ways, you conflate these and you'll end up thinking that you should be talking about climate change in the present and putting them all in the same bucket. But really, for me, climate change in the present is making sure you've just got your centered view of today's risk on what today's hazard actually is. For some perils, it's arguable whether you need to center that view because the natural variability is so large in the background. But for things that Eric so wonderfully showed in his, things like precipitation-driven perils and heat-driven perils, you really need to think about where your centering of that is. And by centering, I mean, obviously, catastrophe modeling to date has largely been driven by historical views of risk and taking history and assuming that that's a good predictor of the future. But if you're looking at the last 40 years or so, maybe your view of risk is centered 20 years in the past. So making sure you've accounted for that. And then obviously we've heard about sub-perils. One thing we haven't talked about too much is this post-loss amplification shock. One thing that I think has seemed to come out is when we're thinking about the climate change question, it's a bit of a contentious issue, this one, but climate change is a trend factor. And while Eric showed a really nice presentation on why we should see those shocks every now and again coming through, they're still, to me, as a personal opinion, I think, are likely to be lower than the potential shocks we can get from the social aspect. So just in any given year, 100%, loading because of just background conditions, what COVID did to supply chains and everything. So yeah, I think a large part of what I do now and why the work that I do is needed in the market is unpicking all of this and being coherent in the narratives. Because a lot of people don't have these modeling capabilities internally. And I think until we can do that actually as a market, we're sort of constrained with how we're going to evolve catastrophe modeling. I hope in my presentation I'll pick up that one as well. But I think one thing that we haven't also talked about that I would like to mention here, people get very frustrated with me, I think, when I say that climate change is maybe a secondary thing when we're looking at the present. And obviously I say that very carefully. There's certain aspects of it that are very important, but when I say secondary, I mean secondary relative, I think, to this longer term issue of climate change that we're entirely missing, I think, as an industry, and we don't do a good job of. And it's these climate tipping points. To me, those are the really big challenges of climate change. when we know as an industry we have to deal with such severe shocks in the exposure side and the vulnerability side in any given year, it's likely to me that anything in the hazard is going to be relatively well constrained for the peril regions that we're looking at. But the things like massive ice sheet loss or shutdown of the climate system because of macro climate change, those aren't going to be captured, and those are going to be things that cause massive social destruction, and yet they're entirely ignored, probably because we haven't got models in place yet to deal with them, but arguably I think we should and be able to talk about it too. So big narrative there, sorry, but it's yeah, there's a huge amount to try and help educate people across the market on. And I think one of the biggest complexities that I have, certainly as one of those independent, trying to be a multi-model user, is that the sophistication of users across the market is so varied. And you can go from, you know, companies that are sat here with me, really specific, really targeted questions for some extremely complex and narrow use cases, to just tell me what climate change is going to do to every single peril region and tell me within 5 days. Okay, so there's a massive amount out there that I think a lot of model vendors are doing a good job of trying to pick that up. A lot of the niche ones are doing an excellent job of trying to help with that question that are at the back of the room here. But I would also say that that modeling itself too is very nascent, and that the answers are very fluid right now. And believing any of them with a lot of confidence is probably a push.
Mm. And that links also to what Ewald said. We have to own our view of risk. So we need an independent opinion to own it, to decide which risks fits us. Ewald?
Can I just add a thought? Yes. On the standardization efficiencies, and it was mentioned by Dickie before. The challenges are plentiful about all this future, the tipping points and all of that. What we have to make sure is that the brainpower goes there. So I totally agree, the opportunity we have as an industry on standardization is huge. I think everybody's aware. Progress, I believe, is there. It could be quicker. We have introduced a multi-vendor ecosystem, which is the direction that we want to go. Standardization becomes key if we operate that system. And we didn't have a year ago a data standard. We have an internal exposure standard. We didn't have a standard for results, and that's why we brought in the open results data standard from Oasis, so to actually have a standard. And we look into the OED as well on the exposure side, not to duplicate internal standards, but to get the efficiency navigating in the market. So I think we also have choices, and we can take these decisions and move forward and allocate resource away from getting busy on the, I would say, least important side, and just really focusing on those challenges that really need our attention.
Good. So do we have any question in the audience? We have one online. That is, should CAD models include existing knowledge of climate change and on social inflation, or should this be done outside main models used? Who wants to answer that one?
Well, I could take this one. Yeah, I mean, my view is clear. Yeah, I mean, if we're building a model either as a vendor or as a community or within a company like Swiss Re, I think we use all the knowledge we can that informs our risk, and climate change and social inflation are certainly valid risk factors. So I would include them. Of course, you know, with climate change, it's always important to, or with any risk factor that's changed over time, it's important to be conscious of what time frame you model for, right? So with climate change, typically if you want to build a risk model that reproduces or that is fit for purpose for the next underwriting cycle, we need to also tailor the hazard and everything for that underwriting cycle, meaning we look at the climate change as it has occurred to date and not a 2050 view or something like that. At the same time, of course, I think just as a modeling community, an open source community, this means that we will have to debate as time goes on. And as you mentioned, right, as climate change progresses, the signal will become stronger, which means that it will be a tougher game to say where we are. You know, if we reach a tipping point, for instance, this won't happen overnight and we'll all wake up and agree, okay, a tipping point has reached and we're now here. This will really open up uncertainties, and we'll have to, within the community, come to grips with that, or within your company, you'll have to come to grips with that. So I think that there's a lot of new elements coming in on climate change, and the same on social inflation. It might spread to other jurisdictions. So there as well, I think the uncertainty as time goes on will rather increase and decrease, which means that we have more discussions to come.
I think it's a great question, and it really, I can't answer again, but like just pushing it further, I really think that there's this issue, I suppose, in the industry at the moment that what we're all largely tied to single or, you know, dual catastrophe risk models from major vendors. And, you know, some of the vendors in the room are helping us to break out of that. But it feels like the majority of work done with CAT models is done operationally. So we do portfolio roll-ups, and then it's used across the entire company, the output there. And my feeling is potentially that's not what should be the case. You know, I believe there's still a big place for the major vendors in what they do and having this very operational output. But when we want to suddenly go, okay, well, what is it? You know, where could we be very wrong and why? You know, whether it's climate change or whether it's social inflation, I don't necessarily believe that it's the major models that can do that the best. And it might be these more flexible ones, more transparent ones, or more just very targeted at these specific question models that can actually help inform us and then help make us make better decisions in the back end after having done the operational first run with a major model vendor. So I think that there's a potential shift, and there should be a shift towards getting used to multiple models and having ensemble modeling platforms that I don't necessarily think are widely used yet in the industry.
Any question? Yes?
Pretty much all of you have talked about climate change, but as we look across sort of other unmodeled risks, you know, contingent BI, cyber, you know, casualty, where would you like to see the industry, particularly the model vendors, you know, here and perhaps those online, giving you greater support?
Maybe Ewald, you can answer that.
I can start. I think on the cyber side, there is quite some analytics out there, and I think it has come a long way. This choice is, our goal is that we have the view of 3 to 4 leading vendors in terms of cyber analytics, and we don't like the output to converge because we believe that's it's just not possible. It's a very challenging risk to understand, and it's very easy to be misled. And we kind of, as teams are looking at broader sets of scenarios, you kind of, the synergies, but there's also risk to kind of, you know, you bring maybe a Nat Cat approach into a cyber approach that simply is not appropriate. I think the important thing is that we have these cyber analytics out there, and this applies to other like casualty cat. Maybe there could be a bit more diversity there. We believe in parallel, it's very important, again, to take ownership. There's no way you would tie a risk appetite to, even if it's a leading and solid model on the cyber side, it's just, it needs ownership. And it's a data question as well, sourcing data from customers who commit to the data that they have provided, and to think through these scenarios, maybe not in the most sophisticated way and get lost in the detail, but do this solidly and recognizing how much uncertainty is there in estimating a global ransomware attack or a global cloud outage. Those kind of, you know, huge kind of tail losses, how this really would look. We have to recognize the uncertainty and take the ownership and the judgment call. And the cyber analytics, I believe, helps a lot. I really wouldn't want to miss any of the views that we looked at. And I think what is important, and that's the same on the climate change side, it's a cyber, the casualty cat, the exchange. So I see the industry participants, but also the vendors, to invest in having a view and have the dialogue like we can have today. I believe is extremely valuable to have open exchange the notes, be transparent on assumptions, and collectively move in the right direction. I think we all have, share the passion of it's a great business. Sustainability is a key part of what we do, and I think we can go a long way collectively.
Thank you, Ewald. Any more questions here in the room? Oh yes, Beat.
But more a question back to Erich, to your research in terms of extreme value distributions. How much do you think your research has already reached the CAT modeling companies or the CAT modeling providers? That they don't rely on extreme value distributions that are actually outdated, that are skewed, that are that we don't have after each event a learning that we have to readjust because we have seen a new record. What's your view there on the CAT modeling market side?
I mean, as far as I can judge it, I think the CAT modeling is really quite advanced in many of these aspects, and simply because we do have a lot of exchange, right? We have with here in Zurich with different partners, we have a lot of exchange with ETH and other universities, and the same actually holds, I think, for the UK with many universities collaborating. So I think a lot of this is actually appreciated by you who are also experts. I think there are still a few things where even from a scientific point of view, I think one comes actually to this event attribution where we underestimated this effect, that we sort of used to be overconfident by looking at too short periods and sort of adjusting our extreme value distribution to too short periods, and sort of underestimated the uncertainty. So this basically ultimately comes back to the probably internal variability, which I've been sort of trying to highlight, that for many of the questions we're addressing here may actually be the larger problem, the one I'm more worried about, that we sort of underestimate the decadal variability by only looking at too short time period. And I think so. Yes, so this exchange is starting, and I think there are still, we basically learning, but I think the lag is actually not so large. And I think even within the science community, I think we also still have to work to people raise awareness that sort of we used to be with some of these aspects, used to be overconfident. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question for Eric. And this comes online in a Slido, and it says, how can we model tipping points?
That's a very interesting question, yeah. It's a challenging one, but I do want to stress that some of these tipping points that are highlighted in the IPCC reports, that basically some of these emerged from climate models. So they have been identified first in climate models. One is basically the Amazon forest dieback, for instance. This basically came out, or also the collapse of the thermohaline circulation, in other words, Gulf Stream in North Atlantic, basically they have been modeled. It turns out they sort of emerged often in quite simple models, and the more advanced the models became, the more processes basically were built in. Some of these processes became more stable. So actually, if you see sort of the latest assessment of IPCC AR6, these tipping points are still there as a major challenge. And there are a couple of them, like the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, if we warmed more than 2 degrees, that are very high confidence, but this is not abrupt often. This is some long-term changes. So yes, they are included in some of the model. Ultimately, it goes through physical understanding, because your climate model could produce any type of tipping points, but you have very much little confidence unless you actually understand the processes that get you there. And I think there's a huge push in the community now to try to further and increase this understanding of these elements. It is clear that this is one of the major challenges, particularly in the long term. We do have a good understanding that the risk of running into these tipping points increases the further we basically go away from a known climate state. I think this is that's the state where we have highest confidence. But I guess there is large model disagreement on when these tipping points are triggered.
And we have another question related to the physical climate storyline approach that Eric introduced. It's in a slide and it says, is the output from models used to generate physical climate storylines viable and able to be operationally incorporated into natural catastrophe models?
Yeah, please get in touch with me. It's not operational yet, definitely not, but I think we could definitely talk about possibilities. And there is also, we're not the only ones working on this. So the idea basically comes from Ted Shepard at the University of Reading. So they having ideas, and in this Horizon Europe or Horizon 2020 project I've been mentioning, we're sort of trying to bring together different approaches. And there's also a similar approach by the UK Met Office called Unseen, where they use weather forecasting model, or basically run over the past, sort of similar strategy as they used to produce tropical cyclone event sets to actually specifically look for those most extreme events. I think we sort of try to team up. And so if you're interested, I think there will be only some individual cases, but let's get in touch and we could see where we can go. I think there's a huge opportunity and I think a very interesting emerging field.
Any question, any more from the live audience here on site?
Can I jump in on the operationally? Because that's a really good question. Eric just answered very well, but the word operationally is something that I really want to hone in on here. Like I think so. Are we able to take the output from models used to generate the physical climate storylines? Is that data available and then able to be operationally incorporated into Nat Cat models? I think that word operationally is so important, and it's something that isn't passed back to academia enough. So by operationally, it implies, well, what decisions are you making with that output? And from the storylines idea, I'm not sure what operational decisions you would make other than being able to communicate what your worst case scenario might be and anything around that. But I'm not sure exactly what operational decision. I think as an industry, we need to do better at thinking of foundational questions and foundational decisions that are operational in our industry and being able to pass them back to people like Eric so that we can come up with operationally implemented data.
Thank you, Tom. And we have a few seconds for the last question, which says, climate change shows us that extreme events around the world are connected. Are we going to have more global multi-peril models to account for this? Who wants to answer that? Ewald, are you?
Yeah. I think this is going to be critical, and I think the last 3 years have actually given us a lot of good data points. So it was one of the bullet points there on my slide on unmodeled. Now, what we started is we look at around 45 scenarios, accumulation scenarios globally. This is P&C, and we started to build the matrix that really looks at the connection points between those scenarios that typically are looked at independently. But we know that this is a simplification. Now, when you look at this after, just kind of collecting the data from the last couple of years, primarily COVID, but other events that we have seen are all connected. Yeah. How can a hurricane with a casualty cat event, or how can a pandemic and the casualty event be connected? What clearly becomes visible is that there's probably more connection points than what we believe there is. So you look at this matrix, maybe with some distance, and you go like, how do we actually implement that? Now, I believe this is going to be a very critical part. I think the demand is there, and I cannot speak for the vendors, but I believe it's important to start to think about where connection points are important, how we can connect those. Some are much more obvious than others. Think about wind and flood, maybe much more easy to implement, but there's just many more connection points than what it appears to be.
Thierry, maybe just to add, right? I mean, you have your job because you're good at your job and it's about accumulation, right? And we have events like COVID or other events that cut across lines of business where we don't have connected models. So if climate change shows us that there's a connection between models, we might have an opportunity to even connect them at a very early stage, right? To connect events on an probabilistic event basis, which is much better than what we have now. So it might make your job easier, not obsolete, but easier as an accumulation manager to come up with it. For me, when I first thought about accumulation sources from climate change, I got scared until I realized that it's not a new phenomenon. It wouldn't be a new phenomenon because we have it in events like COVID.
Yes, I think we are talking about the new generation of Nat Cat models here. It's getting more and more complex, but it's very important to have as much as possible under control. And do we have more questions in the audience? So I think that we can close here this panel. Thank you very much for the questions. Thank you very much for the speakers. I think it was lots of takeaways for all of us. And hopefully in next meeting, we can see the start of this new generation of Nat Cat models where a lot of unmodeled losses, unmodeled risks, are they included already? Or starting to. Thank you very much.
That was a great panel. Thank you all. That was fantastic. So while most of them leave, Tom stays, because the next session is dealing with a topic that I think has existed in our business forever. It's never been dealt with well, and it remains both for the insurance industry, but actually it's a facet and problem of human nature, one of the biggest problems to face. And Tom, if you fix this, you'll have the third greatest thing I've ever seen in this business. But anyway, Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Dickie. I'm not going to fix it, right? I'm just going to shine more lights on it and shine why it's more of a problem than anybody wants to think about. So, I mean, this is why I started the company, right? Maximum Information. It's effectively, I believe that managing severe uncertainty is the biggest challenge for the industry. I believe because of operational realities that a lot of that thinking, a lot of the good thinking that exists in the room, exists in companies all around, is sort of curtailed a little bit because of the types of models we have available. And what I would like to do is try and help open up that world and open up the questions that I think will then allow for much more connected things, whether we're talking about the human side of social inflation or climate change and its impacts to catastrophe modeling. So that just sets the scene. I think of my slides. Oh, brilliant. Okay. Where are we? Okay, so the title, Building Targeted Uncertainty into Oasis-Deployed CAT Models. I'm going to be try to be as pragmatic as possible with that, because obviously uncertainty doesn't really allow you to be too pragmatic. But if I spend the next few minutes at least trying to create a narrative to set the scene of why I think we are where we are, and then I'll go into some things that I hope are building uncertainty into this. You'll see where it can connect. But I think at the moment where we are today, there's an interesting evolution in the market occurring. So if we step back and see, well, how do we get here? Obviously, it was the late 80s, early 90s that we had two major events and more in the background that really caused a lot of insolvencies in the market and caused the fundamental question to be asked, can the reinsurance industry do better than actuarial science for predicting catastrophic events? The solution, as we've talked about, is catastrophe modeling. As we've just talked about on the panel, risk is a function of hazard exposure vulnerability. It was this that I think is the start of the problem, though, that as the models evolved and became extremely complex, most reinsurers had to outsource the modeling to independent vendors, and the business model they had obviously had to protect IP. Effectively, that means that suddenly a lot of the expertise for understanding all of this uncertainty and where it comes from was outsourced. There is a big problem now about trying to unpick and understand that. A large light is being shone shone on it precisely because of climate change, but it certainly exists in the present. And now we have obviously present day regulatory responses like ORSA, future climate change focused ones like CBES, where people have to try and respond and say, this is our view of risk and this is why it's resilient. And frankly, it's extremely difficult to unpick a vendor model that is possibly not black box. I don't like that term. I think the vendors on their part actually do a good job, the major ones, of trying to communicate back to us what's gone on and why, but they still have this problem and challenge of IP. And so this grey box issue still doesn't allow you to fully understand the things that you need for actually responding to some of these regulatory questions. And I think we're sort of there today. That's a large part of what my work in the market is involved with right now. And I would say that the major vendor output isn't particularly helpful for that latest evolution. And in order to answer the questions that are coming from regulators, from investors, and from the public even, understanding and communicating your views of uncertainty is imperative. So if we then step into, well, what is uncertainty in catastrophe modeling? I think there's a few definitions of it, and they differ between catastrophe model vendors and practitioners, but largely it collapses to this type of thing. So you have, on the one hand, you have primary uncertainty, the uncertainty in the occurrence of an event, so effectively it translates to frequency uncertainty, and then secondary uncertainty, so the uncertainty in the loss associated with an event once it's occurred. So the severity uncertainty. Similar to the point Thierry was making when we look at the risk equation of hazard exposure vulnerability, those two things mask so many subdivisions that to me should be prerequisites to being able to communicate to the public about managing a view of risk. And to just hammer home that point, a lot of people in the room will be familiar with what I'm going to show just from this title. But this on the left side of the graph there is the loss estimate, for post-loss estimate of what RMS were expecting from Hurricane Maria after it made landfall in the Caribbean in 2017, between $15 and $30 billion. AAR then came out with a range that didn't overlap with RMS's, between $40 and $85 billion, and the actual number, Swiss Re one, was $32 billion. The reality is, well, firstly, how can a risk manager understand and communicate a narrative to the public about what they expect the impact to their company to be when you've got that much uncertainty, and obviously, while it's so clearly wrong as well. I think actually being able to unpick the whys of why those things were being driven to those heights would have actually allowed insurers to manage that risk very, very well. But largely, we aren't able to ask those questions yet. This is a fundamental thing that I think Maximum Information is trying to argue for, really, is that in some sense, again, it came up on the panel here, but the reality for me is that the uncertainty that exists in CAT modeling is so wide that we should be quite open with the fact that I don't think there's an objective best estimate to actually get to. So Maximum Information, the name actually stems from an analogous realization that happened in physics and quantum theory, when ultimately people realized that the precision of Newtonian mechanics can't be reached because at the particle scale you just have fundamental uncertainty. Somehow I think we might have forgotten that type of thing in catastrophe modeling, but ultimately to me there is no objective best estimate. We just have a range of answers that our solution exists within. And actually, it's not helpful to just go about the best distribution to collapse something towards a mean of that uncertainty. Instead, you should be applying subjective attitudes to that. Unfortunately, that goes against what science tries to do, which usually aspires to objectivity for good reason. But with the myriad sources and the magnitude of uncertainty, I would argue that it precludes us from reaching objectivity. So the reality is that we just have to be honest about that and then actually show why we've made good subjective decisions about the type of risk we want. Are you a major insurer who doesn't want volatility in your book, or are you a major catastrophe risk reinsurer who thrives on volatility in the book? Should change your actual view of the risk, even if the modeling and uncertainty was the same. Beyond that, I think there's also this extra piece where collapsing all uncertainty in those primary and secondary buckets is not helpful beyond operational implementation. we should be trying to aspire to these layers of complexity. So it's impossible to do that, I think, but this is the big value for me, and this is why I think we're here and why so many people are in the audience and actually understand this already, is that Oasis, actually, this is the big value of Oasis. It's in this framework that we are able to confront that challenge head on. I said in the panel, I think there is still a place and a major place for having a very operational major vendor to tackle the operational portfolio management. But beyond that, for very subjective, very severe risks and catastrophe risks, we need frameworks like Oasis. So as a background narrative, I'm going to give some examples of where I think we can start unpicking the uncertainty. I'm not sure I'm going to go too much more narrative, right? I'm going to go straight into what and why. But I'm going to give you a hurricane example, talk about why it's still there in earthquakes, and I'm then going to try and attach it to some questions as well at the end that we can think about. But building a view of hurricane risk in the present, all Atlantic hurricane models in catastrophe modeling world are underpinned really by the HERD Act 2 observational data. You know, obviously there's some people in the room here that are going further than that and trying to bring in climate model data and weather model data to drive it forward. But still, the statistics are what they are, and they're ultimately underpinned by HERD Act 2. So when you actually break out the hurricane database and you look at it on a sort of, this is a US landfall rate per category. These are the different views you get if you just start your view at different time horizons. So HERD Act 2 goes back to 1851, so that the purple here is 1851 to present. The red is actually when the National Hurricane Center in Miami says that the US coastline was populated enough that we won't be missing a historical hurricane. So that is often the baseline that's used in the industry. So 1900 to present there. The AMO calculation years, I'll get to what the AMO is, but it's an oscillation in Atlantic sea surface temperatures. We have sea surface temperature data that is largely okay for estimating that oscillation back to 1861. So that's the view you'd get if you used 1861 data to present. And so everybody here will be familiar with El Nino. High resolution El Nino data NOAA produces back to or gives out until about 1950. So this is what happens in 1950. What you'll see immediately is that these random choices really, where you're going to start your view of risk from the historical statistics, the view that you can see that the buckets aren't negligible. They don't look negligible, but this is a fundamental thing that isn't really honestly unpicked from the start. If you then translate this through to effectively just sampling from events in an event loss table from a CAT model, this is the type of exceedance probability curve you can get. So for each curve here, that's the return period of wind speeds based on all of the events from that model. What you see, what you see or maybe don't see is just how much probably information is collapsed into those EP curves. And it's very difficult to make sense of where and why they're different. So one thing that we try to do is make sure that you can see them. So what we've plotted here, rather than an EP curve and differences or different EP curves, is we've taken the industry baseline. So that's the 1900 to present data. Obviously, you'll see that the red bar has disappeared. So the zero line is effectively the 1900 to present data. And then the other three, the all data 1851 and the AMO years and the ENSO years are calculated relative to that. One of the really nice things to me, there's a couple of really important views here that are important. While the wind speed decreases largely across the board, across all these different return periods, I would also caveat, ignore largely the 1 in 2, 1 in 5 return periods are not particularly helpful from CAT models. But across the board, you'll see that all the other three, compared to the 1900 to present data, all the other three are below the reliable landfall years, and on the wind speed side by approximately 1%, I think, if you were to average across each one. But that translates to between about 5 and 10% really when you're looking at the losses. So that small change in wind speed largely is 5 to 10 times greater in the loss. So it's this type of thing that I think from that you should be able to communicate to clients firstly why the 1900 to present view of risk is a stable one compared to all the random choices you have. But as you can imagine, this is one in a huge chain of subjective choices that you've got to make when you build a cat model. So that's really the first step in, well, what's your choice going to be? Then you have these more complex things coming in. So this is the present day, as I said, this Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, this oscillation in sea surface temperatures that's hypothesized to affect Atlantic hurricane activity. Effectively, you'll see that this chart shows the historical AMO phases, largely lasting around about 30 years each. We're obviously, according to NOAA at the moment, in a warm phase. We were in a cool phase from around about 1970 to around about 2000. Then there was a warm phase, cool phase. But if you were to take those, you take effectively what I showed the bar chart first. So you subset the historical data that you have into the landfall rates for the positive phase and the negative phase. This is the UP curve on the left that flows through, but this is the return period of wind speeds, the relative difference to the all years that you have. So one of the things here that jumps out at me, right, I've only shown the wind speed change, but remember obviously that the 1% change in wind speed can lead to much bigger differences in losses. But we appear we're in an AMO positive phase at the moment. Should you be using a long-term average? Should you be using an AMO positive view? There's an argument to be made there. Just being able to socialize that, communicate why you might have chosen one over the other is important. There's much more to unpick when you actually go through to choosing these things. When you even then dive into that further, the AMO is just one narrative of many that exist with hurricane rates. Another one is that the AMO doesn't exist and that it was driven by sulfate emissions over Europe. There's another community that believes they both exist or these were both impactful. But effectively here, what you then have is rather than having a cool period in the 1970s to 2000, you have a large amount of sulfate emissions from 1950 to 2000 that actually caused effectively a lot of drying and cooling in the atmosphere and led to a systematically different frequency of hurricanes in the basin. So if you were to remove that subset of where the sulfate emissions were, because of emission standards now, we're unlikely to ever see this again, and then recalculate your rates with that disappeared. There's a very interesting thing here that the no sulfate change is actually largely really sits very close to the reliable landfall years anyway. So I know that this is a big debate in the industry at the moment, that there's a lot of attachment to this idea that we should be only using the no sulfate years, but when you actually flow that through, maybe it's not making a huge change to the actual view of risk. Obviously, this is where I think the narrative is attaching in the market. I think those are extremely important for being able to communicate who you are and what your view of risk is going to be in the present. It's the building of your future risk, though, that everybody wants to know about. And obviously, we can start thinking about the climate change narratives here. So this is now taking information from some key studies on tropical cyclone changes under climate change. These are largely ones that were high-resolution model runs. So high resolution for these climate scenarios is, I've defined effectively here as less or finer than 50-kilometer resolution, largely all around about predicting a 2 degrees C warming from around about 10 or 20 years ago. So this is around about a mid-century warming on an RCP 4.5 or so. But what you end up seeing is what's really fascinating actually about this, if I take you to the relative ones, there's been people that are involved in tropical cyclone climate change things at the moment will know that there's a seminal paper that tried to summarize all of the tropical cyclone literature here to give overall best estimates, gave median estimates that showed the frequency was maybe down, intensity is up, but the ranges are huge and could be something like plus 80% to minus 30%, depending on which basin you're looking at, and possibly even more than that when you're getting into intensity. When you actually end up like trying to refine that question and look to specific studies, when you're going high resolution models or specific emission scenarios, you end up seeing you'll see, forgetting again that 1 in 2 return period is problematic. You'll see that they're all above the 0 line. Suddenly that narrative that they could be both ways is starting to drop away. There's There's a few people that are in the industry, I think, that are trying to push these things and trying to offer solutions, like this is a way to communicate your climate change work at the moment. I would say that's premature. There's premature for a number of reasons. One of the big things that worries me about this is you'll see the tail uncertainty between these modeling seems to collapse, and the tail change overall seems to just drop away from what it is at the 10, 20, 30-year return periods. I believe that might be an issue of having potentially too few events in a single model, and it might actually necessitate looking at multiple models to get these return periods right. Again, speaking to the value of something like the OASIS framework. But then we also know that frequency intensity is just such a narrow view of what climate change is going to do to hurricanes. So thinking about how to change your footprints and what the sub-perils and secondary things are of the hurricanes under climate change mean that this is a very, very simplistic result, and we need to go further. So that's something that we are working on at the moment. I would also say that what we're trying to do here is speaking to Ben's point actually about standardizing the financial module across the industry through Oasis. We're trying to build analytics here, although obviously model independent, that will standardize views across the industry. So this doesn't have to be hurricanes, it doesn't even have to be atmospheric perils. We'd like to get to earthquake, right? So that same foundational question I asked for, well, what start date are you going to use for hurricane when you build your foundational view of risk? With earthquake, it actually can be, well, we know we've basically only got one historical data set to use, but it needs to be declustered to use in an earthquake model build. So what declustering technique are you going to use? And ultimately, this is a combination of using different declustering techniques on top of using some different start dates. And you'll see that you can imagine these changes obviously flow through in relative ways. I'm not going to bother going into that for now. But hopefully, with this type of thinking, we can standardize how uncertainty is talked about across the industry, how it's communicated, and then why it's useful in certain places. Obviously, I believe foundationally, you should be able to communicate to your regulator why you've chosen certain aspects of this in the present, and then be able to talk about this is another piece that's ignored in the climate change question. We should be talking about how uncertainty is changing in the future, not our best estimate. Climate change is fundamentally uncertain because we don't know what emission scenario we're on. If we can't talk about why uncertainty or how uncertainty is changing in the future, it's largely meaningless and doesn't attach to our present. So yeah, there's some really, really big foundational things there. And really, I think all I've shown is the tip of the iceberg. And I think what I'm really saying is that the Oasis framework allows us to explore so much more. So I've only so far worked with event loss tables here, but can we start thinking about opening up the hazard modules in multiple models so that we can really explore some more complex narratives? So there's narratives in the literature. I'm not supportive of, or I'm not saying I'm supportive of necessarily any of these, but there are narratives that show that maybe tropical cyclones slow down in a warmer climate. Maybe they move towards the poles. If they do, effectively what we would like to get to is, well, how does that impact your view of risk? And how does that impact a specific insurer's view of risk compared to the overall market as well? It's a really important point. Then I think there's another side where we should, while we're getting this opportunity to explore the uncertainty space, actually be asking the question what CAT models should be used for. Should they ever be used for single event loss prediction? Hurricane Maria, I think that example would largely argue not, but we also know they do a good job in some places. But again, it's a question of unpicking when and why, and when, particularly when and why not. Then we get to other much more bigger things, right? Does minimum aggregation and portfolio diversification differ between peril region? How does that change with return period? How does that change your use of CAT models? What should we do about multiple models in that instance? A really foundational one for me, the value of CAT models to me actually is in the relative loss. We know there's so much foundational uncertainty in predicting absolute loss. Should we be looking at absolute loss from these? Don't know. My feeling is the market probably sets the absolute rate anyway, so should the value be flowing in elsewhere? Again, another place we can explore with the Oasis framework and multiple models. Another one, and again, I think this speaks to Eric's one, is a single model ever able to capture extreme event or return period volatility? So those really, really rare events that over 100 years, we're probably never going to capture in our observational data, or we'll capture very few of. Are we ever going to get them right? So I think Eric's work, I'd love to be able to bring that type of thing in here. Final thing I just want to hint at, it's not actually anything to do I'm going to talk about today, but one of the things that Oasis and the IDF have been supporting and I've been helping on as well is building a risk explorer to try and actually create open baselines of views of risk, so that we can actually start thinking about, well, if a model is adding another layer of complexity, what value is it adding? And the risk explorer is trying to build a global tropical cyclone view of risk from fundamentally observational data, and then we can start asking questions, well, what does the stochastic track set add, and where does it add value, and why, and what types of portfolios should, or does it necessitate the use of a very complex model for? So really foundational, lots to debate, huge amount of caveats, as you can imagine, on all of the things I've shown here, but I'm quite excited that I think I've been asking these questions for a long time, and for a long time in the market, we've been shut down from really unpicking them. I think there's definitely people, there's obviously the room I'm in, I think certain major reinsurers who have the ability to bring modeling internally possibly have thought about these a lot already, but there's a huge part of the market that just doesn't have the internal capability to firstly have thought about asking these questions, and secondly, if they did, to actually unpick the models that they're using to get to the answers. So I think there's just an explosion of work and modeling that's going to be done soon. Well, I hope anyway, and hopefully I and others can facilitate that. I think that's me.
There are a couple of, any questions from the audience?
Cool. Great. So are you using the Oasis engine or one of the Oasis-based platforms to deliver your proposed solutions? So that's the aim, right? So for now we're prototyping, but we're going to be using the Oasis engine. And if you'd like to talk to me about that, please do. But we're likely to be aiming for early next year for that deployment and for feeds from that. Should there be a push to standardize the CAP model development storytelling to make the qualitative information more digestible? Massively. That's a really great question. I think everybody probably in the room looking at who is here works on scenario analysis, whether it's in the Lloyd's RDSs or any other regulator that asks them for stress tests. I think there's a massive value to start thinking, for us as an industry, to start thinking about, well, what are the standardized things we'd like to ask? Not just from what's going to stress the traditional insurance portfolio, but what can stress now and what's likely to stress with certain aspects. So climate tipping points was one, but can we, there's obviously a question on correlation earlier, can we start thinking about multiple events and having a coherent climate-driven scenario test that we can push through these things? I think it should be a fundamental requirement of model vendors that those type of tests are run and presented transparently. I hope, we can do a good job of an industry to standardize that.
Question at the back there.
Hi, Tom. In your Hurricane Maria example, it looked like if you took up some weighted average of the two predictions, you could get closer to the right answer.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think, So
if we could afford those models, both of them, but hopefully with more Oasis models, you're going to be in that situation where you do have multiple views of risk. Yeah. So how can you use the wisdom of crowds to make better decisions?
So it's great. I don't know. I almost want to come at you and go, I would argue against that, right? But you're right? It's right in the middle of the two. And if you had blended them, you probably would have got something. Well, to be fair, the top end of RMS was very close anyway. But the somewhere in the average, it would have been sort of right. My feeling is that, I guess I'm always coming from this subjective side, and what's the worst case, what's the best case, and who are you? And I worry that us trying to get to that overall average, is maybe distorted. And maybe if it wasn't the Maria case, maybe I'd show a different one where the actual loss prediction was triple or quadruple both of the vendors, and in that case, you're still way out. So I think it's a great question, and I think if we could devise tests even to look at that, right? And to look at, well, if we did use multiple models, are we right more often than when we're not? That would help too. But something, again, because of the Oasis platform and having multiple models, we can suddenly do.
So last quick question, because we otherwise run out of time, from Malcolm.
Thanks very much, Tom. I found the talk really thought-provoking. there's many people in this room who are spending a lot of time coming up with a view of risk because the models are imperfect and they're trying to fix them in imperfect ways because of the points you raised. Perhaps would you see part of the solution that we spend less time understanding vendor models and trying to adjust them, and perhaps spend more time trying to build our own public open source model that we can have full control over?
Definitely, yeah. And that's the first one, right? So that's exactly what I've been trying to do with the IDF and Oasis in that Risk Explorer. I think the idea was conceived as an educational piece, particularly for the places around the world that don't have catastrophe models available. So it just allows people to start thinking of that risk as a function of hazard exposure vulnerability equation. But we need the baseline, and the Risk Explorer is going to be fundamentally very, very crude and very simple. But if we have that baseline, suddenly I think we can get towards managing risk better. I think because of operational reasons, we're always going to need those models, and the amount of time that I feel is wasted by going through the validation process again and again and again, as opposed to just being able to go, well, let's leave the model to do a best prediction of what it's going to do. And then, just thinking about that subjectivity side, just rank your 10 most exposed counties in the US, for example, and start picking them out and going, well, how could they be wrong and why, and what models would say differently, I think would be a massive change. But you need open baselines. I think there's a number of posters in the back of the room from some great model vendors that are more open, and we can start asking those questions, but I would still think that we do need more on that. Can we work together as an industry to get an open, a perfectly open but simple CAT model there for all global peril regions?
Good way to end. Thank you, Tom. Thanks very much. Yeah, you're going to come up. So we're just going to, a couple of things to finish, a couple of thank yous, a couple of points, and a question. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, first, I think I would like to start with the thank you before closing. So first, thank you, Dickie, for helping us organizing it and running the show today. So big applause for you, Dickie. And at the same time, also here, the event team and also the event team from Oasis and the team that helps us really organizing and setting up here everything. Also there, big applause to that team. Thanks a lot. And afterwards, before we close, just that we don't forget it, there is certainty about it. There will be an apéro afterwards, so that one you can count on. Now it depends a bit on when that will happen. I'll leave that a bit to Dickie for his closing remarks, but yes, there will be an apéro. And before that one, also thank to all of you that you came here, that you spent the time here, that you engaged here with the speakers. Also big thank you to the speakers that had really presented very good content and also showed that this collaboration is very important. We had that also with the last remarks from Tom. I think a lot of those things we have to do together. It doesn't make sense that all the companies do the same thing by themselves in their own R&D departments. A lot of that can be done jointly. Also, what we saw already at the beginning with the GEM example, there's a lot of base research we can do jointly, do that together and get smarter together as a market, and then apply that view of risk in your own companies. But the starting point is really the part where you have to do it together. So that's the important part for me. Now,
thank you. I just want to add a couple of things. I need to add some thank yous myself to the Swiss Re team, who've been fantastic. There's so many of them. That's why it's such a smooth operation. Thank you all. To the team behind Oasis, some of whom you've seen here today, many of whom you haven't. They're brilliant, and they make what is so useful, so good today. So thank you all, the ones that have come and the ones not here. A particular thank you to Julia, who's been doing this now for 8 years, standing at the back. She probably won't be doing it for much longer, but I know people have been married less time than you've been working for us, Julia, and probably had less a good relationship. So thank you very much on a personal level from me. Two more things I'd like to say. So the first one is, we talked right up front about what it is that guides you to be able to do what you think you need to do, either for your business or for you as individuals trying to grow and learn in your business. And the constraints, or at least one of the key constraints that you all said online and in the room, was that it's resource and it's cost. I'd like to make a suggestion that while I completely understand that dynamic, you individually and the companies you represent can't afford not to engage in changing the way we run our business. It's just too important. And I think you've seen today a number of people and organizations who are able to, with you, join you on that journey to change the way we run our business, understand our business, select our business, to make sure that that risk that we are facing, that systemic risk that we are facing, is minimized. And when you leave this room, the challenge we all have, of course, is to go back to that busy desk and that lack of resource and that working late and not make an effort to try and do this. Well, I would suggest that I'd like you to consider not doing that and to actually engage. And I'd like to give you an offer of, to add to, in fact, somebody else's offer today, of how that can practically work. So if, for example, you feel like you have a need to understand earthquakes somewhere around the world, talk to John or some of the GEM team or me or some of the Oasis team. We can partner you with others to get you a cost-effective, collaborative, transparent model that's going to be better than the solution you got right now. We are already starting to raise money for an open US hurricane model that will be completely open, involving academics around the world. And in fact, the first conversations I had on that topic were about 18 months ago for two people in Zurich who said, why don't we have that? And it just got me thinking, it's so dumb. So a few of us are working on doing that, as well as a global vulnerability model. We're doing that too. We're also working on a project to try and capture across at least the United States information on social inflation so that we can help the modelers, every modeler, RMS, AIR, CoreLogic, impact forecasting, all the people at the back, any modeler, we don't care, take that information and implement it in their models so that all of us can get a better information about social inflation, because I'm fairly sure it's too hard for any one organization to do it by itself. And there's probably a dozen more things that I could list, but I don't want to take too much of your time. The point is, we are a catalyst for change and innovation and research that you can use if you're prepared to do it. And just the last thing, actually, I meant to say was, and this again has been offered by, I heard Allianz say this yesterday or today, if you have senior executives in your organizations that don't understand why this is important, and if having a conversation with some of their peers at the same level in other organizations would help them change their mind and support what you want to do, we can facilitate those conversations to get senior executives from, we've done it already with SCORE, and we've done it with RenRe, and we can probably do it with Swiss and Allianz and many, many others. So please come to us if that would help you. Penultimate thing, I would just like to say thank you to everybody who's attending online and here as well. I missed that before, thank you very much. And now we are going to go to, in about a minute and a half, it won't take long, a quick Slido survey, because if you ever send out survey questions after events, almost nobody fills them in. So I said, bravely, stupidly perhaps, we're going to try and do a quick survey, and I presume the questions are going to come up, but I can't really remember now. The questions going to come up. Oh, are they?
They are dead. You should have them on your screen if you...
Oh, they have them on the screen, but I haven't got them on mine. That's all right. So there are some questions. Please answer those questions, because that is how we drive these events, by the feedback you get. So the more you give us, the more we can give you back. And we haven't talked about it, but I very much hope we're back here in Zurich next year. And we're definitely going to do a big event in London as well. We did Bermuda this year. We'll have to see where else we're going. So do I have to say anything else, or can they just do that and we can go and have a drink?
The drink part, I think that's not
I need
important.
a drink, I really do. Wonderful, thank you very much. Online, good to see you soon. For those in the room, please enjoy a drink, courtesy of Swiss Re. Thank you very much, talk soon.
Thank you.